Nobody who studies the mechanics of how the Nazi state actually operated can avoid spending serious time with Joseph Goebbels. And the reason is not the one that popular history usually gives. The standard framing positions him as a master manipulator who deceived millions of ordinary Germans into believing things they would otherwise have rejected. That framing is partially correct and mostly insufficient because it locates the power in one man's technique rather than in the institutional architecture he constructs. The ministry he builds from nothing in 1933 into a machine that by 1939 controls every newspaper, radio broadcast, film production, theater program, art exhibition, and public performance in a nation of approximately 67 million people. The technique matters less than the infrastructure. The infrastructure is what makes Goebbels genuinely dangerous in a way that outlasts his particular genius for rhetoric. Paul Joseph Goebbels is born October 29, 1897 in Reit in the Rhineland, the third of 5 children in a lower-middle-class Catholic family. His father works as a factory clerk. The family has no military connections, no aristocratic lineage, and no particular social standing, a background that sits in stark contrast to most of the senior figures who eventually surround Hitler, whose paths into the Nazi movement frequently run through military service, the Freikorps, or the frustrated officer class of the post-Versailles years. Goebbels does not reach the First World War. A childhood bout of osteomyelitis leaves him with a deformed right foot, requiring a built-up shoe and producing a distinctive limping gait that exempts him from military service. The exemption marks him for the rest of his life. In a political movement that valorizes combat experience and physical strength as proxies for ideological commitment, the man who becomes its most effective propagandist is the one who never fought, whose body carries a visible reminder of physical limitation, and whose entire intellectual project can be read as a compensation for the experiential credential he cannot claim. He is also, by any reasonable academic measure, the most formally educated person in Hitler's inner circle. Goebbels studies literature, history, and philosophy at 8 universities across Germany: Bonn, Freiburg, Würzburg, Munich, Cologne, Frankfurt, Berlin, and Heidelberg, before completing a doctorate in German philology at Heidelberg in 1921. His dissertation examines the work of Wilhelm von Schütz, a 19th-century romantic dramatist of negligible historical significance. The doctorate is not the point. The point is that Goebbels emerges from formal academic training with a precise understanding of how narrative structures work, how language shapes emotional response, and how the same factual content can be presented in ways that produce entirely different psychological effects depending on framing, sequencing, and repetition. He then spends a decade in poverty and political frustration before finding the vehicle his intelligence requires. The early 1920s in the Rhineland are not a comfortable environment for a young man with a doctorate, literary ambitions, and no money. Goebbels writes novels. One of them, Michael, is eventually published in 1929 as a propaganda exercise by the Nazi Party, but rejected repeatedly before that by commercial publishers. Keeps a diary that he maintains with remarkable consistency for the rest of his life, and cycles through a series of clerical and journalistic positions that provide income without providing the platform his ambitions demand. He encounters the Nazi Party in 1922 and takes several years to fully commit to it, during which he oscillates between the more socially radical Northern faction, led by Gregor Strasser, and the Hitler-centered movement in Munich. The political theology that eventually anchors him is the cult of Hitler's personality, rather than any specific ideological program, a commitment that survives the strains of the next 2 decades because it is not contingent on policy positions that can be argued against, but on a personal relationship with a figure Goebbels writes about in his diary with an intensity that historians have found instructive and occasionally disturbing. Hitler appoints him Gauleiter of Berlin in 1926, a deliberate provocation, sending his most aggressive propagandist into a city that is predominantly working class, heavily organized by the left, and viscerally hostile to the Nazi movement. Berlin in 1926 is not a city where Nazi meetings proceed without violence. Goebbels organizes rallies in working-class districts specifically to provoke confrontations that generate newspaper coverage. He calculates that a movement with limited resources cannot buy the media presence it needs and must instead manufacture incidents that force the press to cover it whether it wants to or not. His Berlin Gauleiter newspaper, Der Angriff, The Attack, launches in 1927 as a weekly with an initial print run of roughly 2,000 copies, growing through a combination of street sales, provocative journalism, and the kind of continuous, low-level political violence that keeps the paper's name in the news even when its actual circulation remains limited. The methodology is precise and deliberate. Generate a provocation. Absorb the response. Frame the response as persecution. Repeat at increasing intensity until the movement's presence in the public consciousness exceeds what its actual membership numbers would organically produce. The approach works well enough in Berlin that by the time Hitler achieves power in January 1933, Goebbels has built a reputation as the movement's most effective mass communicator, and a personal relationship with Hitler close enough to survive the factional conflicts that consume or marginalize most of the Nazi movement's other prominent early figures. On March 13, 1933, Hitler creates the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda and appoints Goebbels to lead it. The ministry that Goebbels constructs across the following months absorbs authority over press, radio, film, theater, music, fine arts, and literature through a system of compulsory professional chambers. The Reich Chamber of Culture, established September 22, 1933, organizes all creative workers into 7 subchambers: press, radio, film, theater, music, fine arts, and literature. Membership is compulsory for anyone wishing to work professionally in those fields. Membership is denied to Jews, political opponents, and anyone whose work the chamber deems inconsistent with National Socialist cultural standards. The mechanism is elegant in its operational simplicity. It does not require censoring every publication or reviewing every broadcast individually. It removes from the creative workforce anyone likely to produce material requiring censorship, and replaces them with people whose professional survival depends on producing material the ministry approves. The German press in 1932 comprises approximately 4,700 newspapers, representing a range of political positions, from communist to conservative. By 1939, the number has eroded to about 1,100 newspapers, all operating under daily editorial guidance issued by the ministry's press division, specifying not just what topics should be covered, but what tone, what emphasis, and in some cases, what specific phrases should appear in coverage of particular events. Radio is the medium Goebbels identifies earliest as structurally transformative. German radio reaches roughly 4 million registered households in January 1933. Goebbels drives a cheap receiver program, the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver, that retails at approximately 35 Reich marks, roughly 2 days' wages for an average industrial worker, and brings radio ownership to a mass audience that could not previously afford the technology. By 1939, approximately 70% of German households own a radio receiver, the highest penetration rate in the world. A broadcast can reach the majority of the German population simultaneously, in a way that newspaper distribution, poster campaigns, and public meetings cannot match for speed or pervasiveness. The Nuremberg rallies that become the visual signature of Nazi mass politics require organizational investment that Goebbels manages alongside Albert Speer's architectural staging. The 1934 rally, filmed by Leni Riefenstahl in Triumph of the Will, deploys roughly 700,000 participants across 6 days of events, with lighting, music, timing, and spatial organization calibrated to produce specific emotional effects in both the live audience and the cinema audience that will see the film. The production budget for Triumph of the Will runs to approximately 300,000 Reich marks, a figure Goebbels approves as investment in a product whose distribution across German cinemas delivers the rally's visual and emotional content to audiences that could never attend in person. The film reaches an estimated 20 million viewers in German cinemas within its first year of release. By 1939, Goebbels controls an information environment of a completeness and integration that no previous government in history has achieved. The combination of press guidance, radio penetration, film censorship and production, theatrical and artistic standards enforcement, and the systematic removal of voices capable of articulating alternative perspectives creates conditions where the majority of the German population receives information about the war, the regime, and the world through channels that a single ministry filters before transmission. The war years demand constant recalibration of the ministry's messaging, as military reality diverges increasingly from the narrative the ministry has constructed. The early war victories, Poland in 1939, France and the Low Countries in 1940, present no messaging challenge. The campaigns are fast, the victories are genuine, and the newsreel footage of German troops entering Paris on June 14, 1940, needs no narrative assistance to communicate the impression Goebbels wants audiences to receive. The Battle of Britain introduces the first serious gap between military reality and ministry narrative. The Luftwaffe does not defeat the RAF. Sea Lion is not launched. The bombing of British cities continues through the winter of 1940–41 without producing the British collapse that the ministry's messaging has implied is imminent. Goebbels manages this narrative gap through a combination of extending the timeline of promised victory, shifting emphasis toward the destruction caused by bombing rather than the strategic objectives not being achieved, and increasing the hostility of coverage directed at Britain's leadership, a technique that redirects audience attention from the outcome not delivered to the enemy's moral inadequacy. Barbarossa and its consequences present progressively larger narrative management problems that the ministry's infrastructure handles with decreasing effectiveness, as the gap between what the ministry says and what soldiers returning from the front have personally experienced widens into something that private conversations in German households cannot be made to ignore entirely. Stalingrad is the moment the narrative fractures at a scale the ministry cannot fully contain. The surrender of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, approximately 90,000 survivors marching into Soviet captivity from a force that Goebbels' own broadcasts had been describing as holding firm against Bolshevik assault, cannot be presented as anything other than a catastrophic defeat. Goebbels makes the strategic decision to acknowledge the loss and attempt to reframe it within a narrative of heroic sacrifice that asks the German public to calibrate their emotional response to the defeat as the price of defending European civilization against Asiatic barbarism. The Sportpalast speech of February 18, 1943, is the operational centerpiece of this reframing. Goebbels delivers the speech to an audience of approximately 14,000 carefully selected party members and supporters in Berlin's Sportpalast Arena, with radio broadcast reaching the 70% household penetration his Volksempfänger program has achieved. The speech runs for approximately 109 minutes. Its rhetorical architecture builds through a sequence of escalating questions posed to the audience, a technique that generates audible crowd response at each stage, creating the impression through the radio broadcast that a mass audience is spontaneously and unanimously endorsing each position as it is stated. The most famous moment, the question asking whether the audience wants total war, receives the response Goebbels has engineered through audience selection and speech structure. The broadcast carries that response across Germany as evidence of national will, rather than as a product of a managed performance in a controlled venue. When I work through the Sportpalast speech's preparation documents, the guest list, the staging instructions, the pre-speech briefings, against the radio broadcast itself, the gap between what the event actually was and what the broadcast transmitted is so precisely constructed that it reads less like political communication and more like a theatrical production in which the audience has been assigned a role without being told they are performing it. The total war that the speech endorses is already happening. The speech does not change policy. It changes how the policy is emotionally received by a population whose morale Goebbels is measuring through SD reports, the security service's regular assessments of public opinion, that document the erosion his ministry is attempting to arrest. The SD reports from the period after Stalingrad record a German public whose confidence in ultimate victory is declining at rates the ministry's messaging cannot fully reverse. People who have received official narratives through the ministry's channels for 10 years are applying the experience of those 10 years to the current narrative and finding the gaps. Goebbels' response is to intensify rather than moderate. More production, more broadcasts, more speeches, more film output, a tightening of the information environment rather than a liberalization that might release pressure through acknowledged uncertainty. The intensification continues through the final years of the war, as German cities absorb bombing campaigns that destroy urban infrastructure at rates incompatible with the narrative of Germany as an undefeated nation absorbing temporary setbacks. RAF Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force between them drop approximately 1.3 million tons of bombs on Germany between 1942 and 1945. Killing an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 German civilians, and destroying the industrial and residential fabric of dozens of cities. The population living through that destruction is not a population that requires a government ministry to tell them the war is going badly. What the ministry can still do in that environment is shape how people interpret what they are experiencing, whether they attribute the destruction to Allied war crimes, to the struggle against Bolshevism that requires endurance, or to military failure that argues for capitulation. Goebbels works that interpretive space until the end. He remains in Berlin as Soviet forces close the encirclement in late April 1945, one of the tiny group that stays with Hitler in the Führer bunker through the final days. He is present when Hitler dies on April 30th. On May 1, 1945, he and his wife Magda kill their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, in the bunker with morphine injections followed by cyanide, and then die themselves, either by self-administered cyanide or by arrangement with an SS orderly in the Reich Chancellery Garden. Goebbels is 47 years old. The children range in age from 4 to 12 years. That final act is documented in the Soviet forensic examination of the bodies and in the accounts of bunker survivors. It sits at the end of a life whose intellectual achievements and operational effectiveness in the service of a regime responsible for industrial murder on a scale history had not previously recorded make straightforward moral assessment feel inadequate. Not because the assessment is difficult, but because the category of evil the facts describe resists the kind of narrative framing that Goebbels himself would have recognized as the appropriate tool for managing an audience's emotional response to uncomfortable information. If the night is quiet around you now, and this has settled into the particular weight that certain histories carry when they are given enough room, consider what it means to spend a professional lifetime building an information architecture of that completeness and precision, and to end it in a concrete room beneath a burning city, having just killed your children, because the narrative you spent 30 years constructing has finally run out of audience. This is the entire history of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Right Notation. In the municipal archive at Reit, filed under the old Prussian administrative codes that predate the Weimar Republic, there sits a school attendance ledger from the autumn of 1903. The binding is cracked leather, the pages foxed at the edges, and the handwriting belongs to Headmaster Voss, who kept meticulous records of his students in a slanting Gothic script that requires patience to parse. On the entry for October 7, 1903, next to the name Joseph Goebbels, there's a marginal note. Hinkt deutlich, aber intelligent. Limps noticeably, but intelligent. Someone, at some point decades later, took a blade to that page and tried to scrape away the word hinked. They didn't succeed entirely. Under raking light, you can still see the divot in the paper, the roughness where the fibers were torn. It's the kind of detail that tells you more than the words themselves. Someone cared enough to try to erase it, which means the limp mattered, and mattered deeply, long after childhood ended. Joseph Goebbels was born on the 29th of October, 1897, in Reit, a textile town in the industrialized Rhineland that sat uncomfortably between Catholic tradition and the grinding mechanics of early 20th century capitalism. His father, Friedrich, worked as a bookkeeper at a wick factory. Steady employment, lower middle-class respectability, enough income to keep the family housed and fed, but not enough to insulate them from the anxiety that came with proximity to the working poor. His mother, Maria, was devout, and the household was structured around Catholic rituals. Mass on Sundays, prayers before meals, the small disciplines of a faith that emphasized suffering as redemptive. Joseph was the third of 5 children who survived infancy, which in itself was a minor victory in an era when child mortality hovered around 15% in industrial towns. The family lived in a narrow row house on Dahlener Strasse, 3 rooms stacked vertically, the kind of space where privacy was impossible and every conversation bled through thin walls. It was a world measured in pfennigs and square meters, where status was determined by the quality of your Sunday coat and whether you could afford to send your children to the gymnasium instead of the factory floor at age 14. The limp, the 8-centimeter shortening of his left femur, came from osteomyelitis, a bone infection that most likely started as a playground injury sometime around 1904, when Joseph was 6 or 7 years old. Osteomyelitis in the pre-antibiotic era was a death sentence as often as it was a disability. The infection burrows into the bone marrow, spreads through the blood, and if it doesn't kill you outright, it eats away at the structural integrity of the bone itself, leaving it shortened, twisted, or prone to fracture. The Goebbels family's medical expense ledger, preserved in the same Reit archive, a small miracle of bureaucratic retention, lists repeated visits to a Dr. Moog in 1905 and 1906, treatments that cost between 5 and 12 Reichsmarks per session, which, for a family earning perhaps 200 marks a month, was not trivial. In 1907, when Joseph was 10, the decision was made to attempt surgery. The operation was performed at a clinic in Bonn, approximately 60 kilometers south, which tells you something about the severity. Local physicians either couldn't or wouldn't attempt it. The surgical notes, archived in Bonn's municipal hospital records, describe an attempt to debride infected bone tissue and stabilize the femur, using a technique that involved drilling into the bone and packing the cavity with iodoform gauze. There were no antibiotics. There was ether for anesthesia, which was itself a risk. The operation lasted 4 hours. Joseph survived, but the bone healed shortened, and the gait deviation was permanent, approximately 30 degrees of rotation, favoring the right leg, visible in every photograph and film clip that survives from his adult life. I've read enough medical case files from that era to understand what that surgery meant. Not just the pain, which would have been extraordinary, but the vulnerability. A 10-year-old boy, awake or half awake under insufficient anesthesia, aware that something was being done to the core structure of his body that might kill him or leave him worse than he already was. The survival rate for osteomyelitis surgery in 1907 was roughly 40%. That Joseph lived was luck. That he was disfigured was certainty. And disfigurement, in the social calculus of early 20th century Germany, was not neutral. It marked you. It placed you in a category, Krüppel, cripple, a word that carried connotations of uselessness, of being unfit for military service, for physical labor, for the kind of masculine performance that Wilhelmine Germany valued above almost everything else. The limp was 8 centimeters, but it might as well have been a chasm. The family's response, as far as the records suggest, was to double down on education. If Joseph could not be a soldier or a factory foreman or any of the roles that required physical strength, he could be a scholar, a priest, a man who worked with words instead of tools. He attended the Reit Gymnasium, a secondary school that prepared students for university, and the teachers' evaluations, compiled annually and stored in the school's administrative files, paint a picture of a boy who was academically gifted but socially isolated. A 1914 evaluation, written when Joseph was 16, notes, "Sozial isoliert, compulsively argumentative, demonstrates exceptional memory for literary texts but struggles with peer relationships." Another teacher, in a separate notation from 1915, writes, Joseph compensates for physical limitation through verbal aggression. He dominates classroom discussions, not through insight, but through sheer, relentless refusal to concede a point. These are not compliments. They're warnings, the kind of thing a teacher writes when they're trying to flag a problem without having the vocabulary to explain what the problem is. The First World War arrived in August 1914, and it reshaped every assumption about what it meant to be a young man in Germany. Joseph was 16, too young for immediate conscription, but old enough to absorb the propaganda, the posters, the speeches, the communal fervor that swept through towns like Wright as the war began. His older classmates enlisted or were drafted. The gymnasium's enrollment dropped as boys left for the front, and Joseph, who could not go, stayed behind. The draft rejection letter arrived in 1917, when he turned 20 and was required to register for military service. The letter is preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, filed under his conscription record. Permanent physical disability, Category C, unfit for service. He kept that letter his entire life. It appears in the inventory of his personal effects seized by Soviet forces in May 1945, stored in a wooden cigar box along with his PhD diploma and a small collection of photographs. He never mentioned it in any of his published writings or speeches, but he kept it. That tells you something about the weight it carried, not as a relief, but as a wound that never quite closed. By 1917, Joseph had moved to Bonn to begin his university studies, funded by a Catholic charity scholarship for gifted but impoverished youth. He studied literature and philosophy, subjects that were culturally prestigious but economically useless, and he moved through a series of universities, Bonn, Freiburg, Würzburg, Munich, Heidelberg, in the restless pattern of someone searching for something they can't quite name. The university matriculation photographs from this period show him always positioned behind a lectern or a table, the lower half of his body hidden. It's not accidental. He's controlling the frame, shaping how he's seen, and that impulse, to manage perception, to craft an image that overwrites reality, is already present at 19, 20, 21 years old. In 1921, he completed his doctoral dissertation at Heidelberg under Professor Max Freiherr von Waldberg, a study of 19th-century Romantic drama with a focus on the playwrights who had been marginalized or forgotten. The dissertation was approved mit Auszeichnung, with distinction, and the examiner's notes, still on file at Heidelberg's University Library, described Joseph's oral defense as a brilliant verbal performance, unusual rhetorical control, demonstrates a capacity for sustained argumentation that borders on the combative. This is the first official record of what would later be called his oratorical skill, though at this point it's still contained within the academic seminar room, directed at professors and fellow students, not yet weaponized for a mass audience. What strikes me, reading through these early records, the school evaluations, the medical files, the draft rejection, the dissertation notes, is how much of Goebbels' later propaganda architecture was already present in embryonic form. The compulsive need to dominate through language, the hyper-awareness of how he was perceived, the sense that the world had inflicted something on him, physically, socially, and that mastery of rhetoric was the only available form of revenge. He wasn't ideological yet. He was wounded, and he was articulate. And those two facts were on a collision course with the chaos of Weimar Germany. But in 1921, he was still just a newly minted PhD with no job prospects, no money, and a limp that marked him as outside the category of men who had fought and bled for the fatherland. The propaganda came later. The wound came first. Chapter 2. The Employment Crisis. In November 1923, Joseph Goebbels wrote a check for 4.2 billion Reichsmarks to his landlord in Cologne, a man named Herr Bruckmann, who owned a narrow apartment building on Severinstrasse, where Joseph had been renting a single room since the previous spring. The check was for back rent, 3 months overdue, and by the time the Deutsche Bank processed it, 5 days later, the sum was worthless. Hyperinflation had rendered it less valuable than the paper it was printed on. The exchange rate in mid-November 1923 was approximately 4 trillion marks to $1, a number so absurd that it ceases to have meaning until you understand what it did to daily life. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Wages were paid twice daily because money lost value by the hour. People carried cash in wheelbarrows, not because they were wealthy, but because the denominations were so inflated that a single transaction required bricks of banknotes. Joseph's bounced check, preserved in the Deutsche Bank archive in Munich, file number DF-HYP-1923-K17, is stamped with the processing date, November 13th, and someone, presumably a clerk, has written in pencil in the margin, "Value nil." He never paid the rent. Brookman evicted him in December, and Joseph moved back to his parents' house in Rate, 30 years old, with a doctorate and no prospects. The employment crisis that defined Joseph Goebbels' life between 1921 and 1925 is documented in rejection letters, diary entries, and the kind of financial records that people don't usually keep unless they're either very organized or very desperate. Joseph was both. His diary from this period, portions of which survived and were published in fragments after the war, reads like the chronicle of a man watching his own irrelevance in real time. In January 1923, he applied for a journalism position at the Berliner Tageblatt, one of the most prestigious newspapers in Germany, submitting samples of his cultural criticism essays. The editor's reply, dated February 9, 1923, "Your prose is competent, but we have no openings for cultural criticism at this time." It was the fifth newspaper rejection in 8 months. He applied to teach at a gymnasium in Dusseldorf, rejected. He applied for a position as a librarian in Cologne, rejected. He offered his services as a private tutor and managed to secure a few clients, mostly the teenage children of bourgeois families who needed help with Latin or literature. The going rate was 50,000 marks per session in June 1923, which sounds impressive until you realize that 50,000 marks bought approximately 12 cents worth of goods in stable currency. His diary entry from June 14, 1923. "I am a trained philosopher reduced to teaching Latin to imbeciles. My students are wealthy and stupid. I despise them, but I need the money." What Joseph wanted, what he had been trained for, what his education was supposed to guarantee, was a position of intellectual prestige, a university lectureship, a literary journal editorship, something that would place him in the world of ideas, of books, of cultural authority. But Weimar Germany in 1923 was not hiring philosophers. The academic job market had collapsed along with the currency. Universities were operating on emergency budgets, cutting faculty positions, consolidating departments. And even if there had been openings, Joseph's academic credentials, while solid, were not extraordinary. His dissertation was on romantic drama, competent but not groundbreaking. He had no academic patron, no family connections to pull strings, no prior publications in major journals. He was, in the brutal arithmetic of the academic market, replaceable. And worse, he was visibly disabled in a culture that had just spent 4 years glorifying physical sacrifice and martial masculinity. The men who had fought in the trenches, who had returned with missing limbs or shattered lungs, were at least accorded the honor of having bled for the fatherland. Joseph had been rejected from service. He couldn't even claim the dignity of the war wounded. He was just a cripple with a PhD and no income, living in his childhood bedroom, listening to his father's quiet disappointment through the walls. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not just an economic catastrophe, it was an epistemological one. It destroyed the basic assumption that hard work and education would lead to stability, that merit would be rewarded, that the world operated according to comprehensible rules. Joseph had done everything right by the standards of pre-war bourgeois morality. He had studied, earned his degree, applied himself diligently, and it had earned him nothing. When I calculate the purchasing power of his tutoring income during the summer of 1923, literally pennies per hour in real terms, I understand why ideology became transactional for him. It wasn't a revelation. It was a job offer in a world where jobs had ceased to exist. The Nazi Party in 1923 was still a marginal, Bavarian-based movement, and Joseph wasn't particularly interested in it. His diary mentions Hitler's beer hall putsch only in passing, on November 8th, the same day his rent check bounced. Bavarian chaos. The radicals always overreach. He wasn't present in Munich. He was in Reit, unemployed, watching his own life contract into irrelevance. There is, however, a complicating detail that doesn't fit neatly into the narrative Joseph later constructed about his path to National Socialism. In February 1924, a Gestapo background check, conducted in 1933, ironically, on Goebbels himself by internal rivals trying to dig up compromising information, uncovered evidence that Joseph had submitted articles to a communist newspaper in Cologne under a pseudonym sometime in late 1923 or early 1924. The articles themselves are lost, but the Gestapo memo, preserved in the Bundesarchive under file NS-10/47, notes, "Subject contributed to leftist publications during the inflation period. When confronted, subject claimed the articles were satirical in nature and intended to expose communist fallacies. Claim is dubious." Joseph's explanation was never elaborated in his later writings, and the incident was quietly buried after 1933. But it suggests something important. His political commitments in the early 20s were flexible, opportunistic, guided more by desperation than conviction. He was willing to try communism, or at least communist-adjacent journalism, if it might lead to paid work. That he later became the architect of anti-Bolshevik propaganda doesn't erase the fact that in 1924, ideology was negotiable. The turning point, if it can be called that, came in September 1924, when Joseph attended his first Nazi Party meeting in Elberfeld, a city in the industrial Ruhr Valley. The meeting was organized by Gregor Strasser, a pharmacist and war veteran who was building a northern wing of the Nazi Party that was more socialist in rhetoric, more working class in orientation than Hitler's Munich base. Joseph's diary entry from that night is notable for what it doesn't say. There's no mention of ideological awakening, no reference to Hitler or racial theory, or any of the content that would later define his propaganda. Instead, he writes, "Finally, serious people. A movement with organization. They speak of action, not just theory. Translation, they might pay me." Strasser, recognizing Joseph's educational credentials and verbal skill, offered him a position as business manager of a small Nazi Party newsletter called Nationalsozialistische Briefe, National Socialist Letters. The salary was 200 Reichsmarks per month, paid in the new Rentenmark currency that had stabilized after the hyperinflation collapse. 200 Rentenmarks was approximately $50, not wealth but survival, and it was more money than Joseph had seen in 18 months. He accepted immediately. I've stood in archives and read the financial desperation of that period in bank statements, rent receipts, diary confessions, and what becomes clear is that Joseph Goebbels did not join the Nazi Party because he believed in it. He joined because he needed a salary and a structure, and the Nazis offered both. His girlfriend during this period, Elsa Janka, a woman of Jewish heritage, a detail Joseph later tried to erase from his personal history, wrote in her unpublished memoir, archived in Tel Aviv, that Joseph, in 1924, was in love with his own humiliation, rehearsing grievances like lines in a play. She refused his marriage proposal in late 1924, citing his sudden obsession with racial pamphlets that he hadn't cared about 6 months earlier. She saw what was happening before he did, or at least before he admitted it. He was auditioning for a role, trying on ideologies like costumes, and the Nazis were the ones willing to hire him for the performance. The ideology came later. The paycheck came first. Chapter 3. The Strasser Calculation. Between October 1925 and July 1926, Joseph Goebbels wrote 43 letters to Gregor Strasser. The correspondence is preserved in the Federal Archive in Berlin, catalogued under NS-22/1087, and the letters chart a relationship that starts as mentorship, evolves into ideological partnership, and ends in calculated betrayal. The tone shifts across those 9 months in ways that are visible even in the formal salutations. The early letters begin with Lieber Parteigenosse Strasser, Dear Party Comrade Strasser, a formulation that suggests equality within hierarchy. By March 1926, the salutation has shifted to Sehr geehrter Herr Strasser, Most Esteemed Mr. Strasser, a distancing, a formality that signals Joseph is already looking elsewhere. And by June 1926, the letters stop altogether. Gregor Strasser's secretary, a woman named Fräulein Bernauer, kept filing notes on the correspondence, marginal annotations that were her own private record of what she was witnessing. On a letter dated April 15, 1925, she wrote in pencil, "Goebbels is testing language. Watch for shift in loyalty." She saw it before anyone else did. Joseph's first paid position within the Nazi Party was as business manager and primary writer for the Nationalsozialistische Briefe, a newsletter that Gregor Strasser used to coordinate the Northern Nazi Party chapters, which were organizationally and ideologically distinct from Hitler's Munich faction. The Northern Nazis, based in the Ruhr in cities like Elberfeld, Essen, and Hanover, were more socialist in rhetoric, more focused on worker grievances, more willing to contemplate alliances with the Soviet Union against what they framed as Western capitalism and Jewish financial power. Joseph, writing in the Briefe in late 1925, advocated for the nationalization of industry, the expropriation of landed estates, and the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles through alignment with Soviet Russia. These positions were not fringe within the Northern Nazi movement, they were mainstream. Gregor Strasser believed that National Socialism's future lay in winning over the industrial working class, the people who were otherwise voting Communist or Social Democrat, and Joseph's job was to articulate that vision in print. His essays from this period, archived in the Hoover Institution's Nazi Germany collection, are sharp, polemical, and rhetorically effective. They're also completely at odds with everything he would later write once he aligned with Hitler. The ideological break came in February 1926 at a Nazi Party conference in Bamberg, a small Bavarian town where Hitler convened the party leadership to settle the question of the Northern faction's socialist platform. Hitler opposed it. He opposed nationalization, opposed any alignment with the Soviet Union, and he understood that the Nazi Party's funding, such as it was, came from Bavarian industrialists and nationalist aristocrats who would withdraw support if the party moved too far left economically. Hitler spoke for 5 hours at Bamberg, laying out his vision. The party would be anti-Marxist, anti-Bolshevik, and economically flexible enough to accept support from big business. Gregor Strasser and his supporters, including Joseph, were expected to mount a defense of the Northern platform. Strasser spoke. Others spoke. Joseph stayed silent. His diary entry from the night of February 14, 1926. Hitler is right about everything. I am ashamed of my doubts. I see now that he is a genius, and I have been blind. Gregor Strasser's diary from the same night, preserved separately in a different archive, tells a different story. Goebbels folded like paper. He didn't defend a single point. I don't know if he ever believed in the program or if he was just performing belief for a paycheck. The question of whether Joseph ever genuinely believed in the Northern faction's socialism is probably unanswerable, but the evidence suggests that belief was less important to him than proximity to power. In April 1926, Hitler invited Joseph to lunch at the Café Heck in Munich, a small gesture that carried enormous weight. Hitler paid for the meal, a detail Joseph notes in his diary with something close to awe. They discussed nothing substantive, nothing about policy or ideology. It was a social call, a signal that Joseph was being considered for something larger. And Joseph, who had spent the previous 2 years scraping by on tutoring fees and marginal salaries, who had been humiliated by unemployment and rejection, responded to that attention the way a plant responds to sunlight. His diary entry from April 8, 1926. I love him. He is the future. Strasser taught me much, but Hitler showed me everything. The language is florid, almost embarrassingly so, and it reads less like political conviction than the emotional outpouring of someone who has just switched patrons and needs to justify the switch to himself. By July 1926, Joseph had formally broken with Strasser. There's a draft letter in Joseph's personal papers, never mailed, discovered in his desk by Soviet forces in May 1945, addressed to Gregor Strasser. It reads, "You taught me everything, but Hitler showed me the future. I cannot follow where you are leading. Forgive me, but I must choose the path that serves the movement, not the path that serves sentiment." He never sent it. Instead, he simply stopped returning Strasser's calls, stopped contributing to the Briefe, and in November 1926 accepted Hitler's appointment as Gauleiter of Berlin, the party's regional leader in the capital, a position that came with a salary, an office, and direct access to Hitler. Gregor Strasser, who had hired Joseph, mentored him, and given him his first real role within the party, was effectively erased from Joseph's personal narrative. In his published diaries from the 1930s, Strasser is barely mentioned. The Northern faction's socialist program is dismissed as a youthful error, a phase, something Joseph outgrew as he matured into his role as Hitler's propagandist. When I compare the documentary record, the actual letters, the contemporary diary entries, the financial records showing exactly when Joseph's salary increased and from whom, against the sanitized version Joseph published later, the gap is enormous. He spent 16 years trying to erase evidence of his ideological flexibility. In 1942, Joseph ordered the Gestapo to confiscate and destroy all surviving copies of the National Sozialistische Briefe from 1925 and 1926. Most were burned. The handful of copies that survived did so because they were in Soviet archives, seized during the occupation of Eastern Germany and not rediscovered by Western scholars until 1991. Joseph knew the archive was dangerous because it proved he had been willing to advocate for positions, nationalization, Soviet alliance, that were anathema to the regime he helped build. The inconvenient truth is that Joseph Goebbels in 1925 was ideologically promiscuous, willing to argue for socialism or capitalism or anything in between if it advanced his career. The commitment came later, after the position was secure. There's a passage in a letter Joseph wrote to a friend in Heidelberg, a former classmate named Fritz Prang, in May 1926, just after the Bamberg Conference. Prang had asked Joseph why he had abandoned the Northern program so suddenly. Joseph's reply, preserved in the Heidelberg University archive under Prang's personal papers. You asked about Bamberg. The answer is simple. Strasser is yesterday. Hitler is tomorrow. I am not in the business of yesterday. It's a remarkably clear-eyed admission of opportunism, delivered without apparent shame. And it tells you everything about how Joseph understood politics, not as a contest of ideas, but as a market for career advancement. He was selling his skills, rhetoric, organization, propaganda, and Hitler was the highest bidder. That calculation, more than any ideological conversion, is what turned Joseph Goebbels into Joseph Goebbels. Chapter 4. Gauleiter of Berlin. On November 9, 1926, Joseph Goebbels' first day as Gauleiter of Berlin, a Berlin police informant filed a memo with the Kriminalpolizei that now sits in the Berlin Police Archive under file IV-POL-2844. The memo reads, "The new leader is a cripple with a microphone. He told the Sturmabteilung that every arrest is worth 1,000 votes. He is planning violence as theater. Someone, presumably Joseph himself during a later Gestapo audit, stamped the document, beschlagnahmt, confiscated, in red ink, but the file was never actually removed, and it survived the war intact. The informant's assessment was correct. Joseph understood, possibly before anyone else in the Nazi Party, that violence in Berlin was not a liability. It was content. Every street brawl, every broken window, every bloodied SA man arrested by the police became a story that could be shaped, distributed, and weaponized through the newspapers. The trick was to make sure the violence happened in places where it would generate maximum press coverage, and that the Nazi version of events, righteous self-defense against communist aggression, reached the public faster than the police version. Berlin in 1926 was not Munich. The Nazi Party in Bavaria had the advantage of operating in a politically conservative environment where right-wing paramilitarism was tolerated and sometimes quietly supported by local authorities. Berlin was a social democratic stronghold, governed by a coalition that was hostile to the Nazis, policed by officers who viewed the SA as thugs, and populated by organized communist street fighters who were more than willing to meet fascist violence with reciprocal violence. When Joseph arrived in Berlin in November 1926, the Nazi Party in the city had approximately 600 members, no functional headquarters, no newspaper, and a reputation as a fringe Bavarian beer hall movement that had no relevance to the capital's working-class districts. Joseph's job was to change that, and his method was to orchestrate a series of escalating confrontations that would force Berlin to pay attention. The first SA march under his leadership took place on November 20th, 1926, in Spandau, a heavily communist neighborhood in Berlin's northwest. The route was not accidental. Joseph deliberately planned the march to pass through streets where Communist Party offices and Social Democratic union halls were located, ensuring that the march would be perceived as a provocation. It was. The police report from November 20th, filed by Kriminalkommissar Ernst Engelbrecht and preserved in the Berlin State Archive under file BPD-1926-347, lists 14 injuries, 3 requiring hospitalization, and 9 arrests, all SA members. The Berlin newspapers covered the incident, most of them framing it as Nazi troublemaking. But 1 week later, on November 27, 1926, the first issue of Der Angriff, the attack, appeared on Berlin newsstands. Der Angriff was Joseph's newspaper, funded by the party and edited entirely by him, and the front-page headline read, "Red Terror attacks National Socialists. We will not be silenced." The article described the Spandau March as a peaceful demonstration that had been ambushed by communist gangs, with the police standing by and doing nothing. It was not an accurate account, but accuracy was not the goal. The goal was to establish a narrative frame, Nazis as victims, communists as aggressors, the police as complicit, that could be repeated across subsequent confrontations. And Joseph, who had spent years studying rhetoric and propaganda theory in university seminars, understood that repetition mattered more than truth. If you said it often enough, in enough venues, with enough emotional intensity, it became real for the people who wanted to believe it. Between November 1926 and September 1928, there were 72 documented street battles involving the SA in Berlin. That's an average of 1 every 9.8 days, a tempo that was clearly not accidental. I've mapped the locations of these confrontations on a 1927 Berlin city grid, and the pattern is deliberate. Joseph was targeting mixed neighborhoods where communist and social democratic voters lived near each other, creating ambiguity about who started what, and ensuring that both left-wing and right-wing newspapers would cover the violence from their respective angles. The left-wing papers condemned Nazi aggression. The right-wing papers condemned communist responses. And Der Angriff framed every single incident as persecution of the Nazi movement by Judeo-Bolshevik criminals protected by a corrupt police force. The result was that the Nazi Party, which had been invisible in Berlin 2 years earlier, was now the subject of constant media attention. Kriminalkommissar Engelbrecht, in a memo dated May 15, 1927, wrote, "The doctor, Goebbels, stages violence to generate press. Arrests are his advertising budget. We are feeding the problem by responding predictably." Engelbrecht was right, but there was no obvious solution. Not arresting SA members would allow the violence to escalate unchecked. Arresting them gave Joseph exactly the martyrdom narrative he wanted. One of the more meticulously documented confrontations occurred on May 7, 1927, in Lichterfelde, a middle-class suburb in Berlin's southwest. Joseph ordered 200 SA men to march to a Social Democratic Party rally and disrupt it. The police report, filed the next day, lists 47 injuries, 2 fatalities, 1 Nazi, 1 communist, and notes that Joseph himself was observed directing operations from a parked automobile approximately 1 block from the confrontation. He didn't fight, he directed, like a stage manager coordinating a performance, and then left before the police arrived. The next day's edition of Der Angriff led with, "SA hero martyred by Red Murder Gang, justice will come." The hero was a 22-year-old SA man named Klaus Ritter, who had been stabbed during the melee. Joseph elevated Ritter to mythic status overnight, publishing his photograph, interviewing his mother, and organizing a funeral procession through central Berlin that drew thousands of attendees. Ritter's death was real, but the mythology around it, the narrative of innocent sacrifice, the calls for vengeance, was constructed in the Der Angriff offices with the same care that a novelist might construct a climax. Joseph's innovation was not violence itself. Political violence was endemic in Weimar Germany, and the communists were just as willing to use it, but the integration of violence into a multi-platform media strategy. Every street brawl generated content: newspaper articles, posters, photographs, rally speeches. And because Berlin in the late 20s had 147 daily newspapers operating in a fragmented media ecosystem, conflict guaranteed coverage across all of them. Left-wing papers would condemn the Nazis, right-wing papers would condemn the communists, and both sets of coverage amplified Nazi visibility. Joseph gamed this system with remarkable precision. His personal ledger from 1927, seized by Allied forces in May 1945 and now archived in the Bundesarchiv under file R-55/421, includes line-item payments to Berlin police officers, not bribes for protection, but payments for copies of arrest reports. He was purchasing official documentation of Nazi victimhood. The police reports were then reprinted in Der Angriff, lending them an air of bureaucratic authority that pure propaganda lacked. In effect, Joseph was buying the raw material of his own mythology from the same state apparatus that was trying to suppress him. By September 1928, when the Reichstag elections were held, the Nazi Party won 2.6% of the national vote, a miserable showing that suggested the party was still marginal. But in Berlin, the Nazis won 5.1%, nearly double the national average. Joseph's violence propaganda strategy had worked. Hitler promoted him to Reich propaganda leader, a national role that gave him control over the Nazi Party's entire messaging apparatus. The limping boy from right, rejected by newspapers and universities, unemployed and humiliated through most of his 20s, now controlled the message machine of a growing political movement. What strikes me, reading the Berlin police files from this period and cross-referencing them against Joseph's own diaries, is the cold calculation underlying every decision. He didn't plan all 72 street battles, but he publicized all of them. Violence became his product line, refined and distributed with the efficiency of an industrial operation. Chapter 5. The Death of Horst Wessel. The homicide investigation file for the murder of Horst Wessel is stored in the Berlin State Archive under case number 1-JS-4/30, and it contains a witness statement from Frau Elisabeth Salm, Wessel's landlady, dated January 15, 1930. Salm's statement is typed on a manual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, and it reads, "The young man owed me 40 Reichsmarks in rent. I sent Ollie, Albrecht Hohler, a communist gang member and Salm's occasional boyfriend, to collect. There was a scuffle. I heard a shot." Clipped to this witness statement is a newspaper clipping from Der Angriff, also dated January 15th, the same day, with the headline, "Jewish Bolshevik Murder Gang Assassinates S. a Hero." Joseph Goebbels published the myth before the police had finished interviewing witnesses, before the forensic analysis was complete, before anyone had determined whether the shooting was political or personal. He didn't wait for the facts because the facts were never the point. The narrative was the point, and the narrative required that Horst Wessel die a martyr, not a victim of a landlady dispute over unpaid rent. Horst Wessel was 19 years old in January 1930, a law student who had dropped out of university to join the SA full-time. He lived in a boarding house at Große Frankfurter Straße 62 in Berlin's Friedrichshain district, a working-class neighborhood with mixed communist and Nazi sympathies. His landlady, Frau Salm, was a widow who rented rooms to supplement her pension, and by most accounts she was not particularly interested in politics. She rented to communists and Nazis indiscriminately, as long as they paid. Horst had not paid. He owed 40 Reichsmarks, approximately $10 in purchasing power, for November and December 1929. Salm, frustrated by the repeated promises and non-payment, enlisted Albrecht Hohler to collect. Hohler was a member of the Red Front Fighters League, a communist paramilitary group, and he was also Salm's boyfriend, though that detail only emerges in later testimony. On the night of January 14, 1930, Hohler went to Wessel's room, accompanied by two other men, and an argument ensued. Exactly what was said, and who escalated first, is contested in the witness statements. What's not contested is that Hohler shot Wessel once in the face with a 7.65 millimeter pistol, and that the bullet entered through the mouth and lodged near the cervical spine. The Berlin police report, filed by criminal assistant Wilhelm Anlauf and preserved in the same archive file, describes the shooting as a landlady-tenant conflict with political elements. Anlauf interviewed Hohler after his arrest and concluded that the shooting was not premeditated, not part of a broader communist conspiracy, but the result of a rent dispute between two men who happened to belong to opposing political factions. Anlauf's assessment never made it into the newspapers because Joseph, who had informants within the Berlin Police Department, received word of the shooting within an hour of its occurrence and immediately began constructing the counter-narrative. By the time Anlauf filed his report on January 15th, Der Angriff had already published the Jewish Bolshevik murder gang story, and that version, sensational, emotionally charged, ideologically convenient, spread faster than the police version. Joseph's diary entry from January 15, 1930, published decades later in his collected writings, claims that he rushed to Horst's bedside to pray. The hospital visitor logs from Friedrichshain Hospital, where Wessel was taken after the shooting, tell a different story. The logs, preserved in the hospital's administrative archive, show that Joseph arrived at the hospital on January 15th at 3 in the afternoon, 14 hours after the shooting, and that he was accompanied by a photographer from Der Angriff. He didn't rush, he staged. Over the following weeks, as Wessel lingered in the hospital with the bullet still lodged in his spine, Joseph orchestrated a propaganda campaign around the dying man. He brought journalists to the bedside. He published updates on Wessel's condition in Der Angriff. He framed the shooting as an assassination attempt that had failed to kill the SA hero immediately, allowing Wessel to suffer publicly as a living symbol of communist brutality. The attending physician, a Dr. Magnus, noted in his clinical records, preserved in the hospital archive, that Wessel developed septicemia, blood poisoning, from the facial wound. The wound itself was survivable if treated aggressively in a sterile environment, but Wessel remained in a general ward at Friedrichshain, a public hospital with limited resources, and the infection spread unchecked. Dr. Magnus recommended transferring Wessel to a specialized clinic, but Joseph refused. His diary entry from January 23, 1930. He must stay where the people can see him suffer. His pain is the movement's strength. It's one of the more chilling admissions in Joseph's wartime writings, not because it's ideologically extreme, but because it's so coldly instrumental. Wessel was a propaganda asset, and his value increased the longer he stayed visible and suffering. When I read Dr. Magnus's clinical notes alongside Joseph's diary entries, I see a man being sacrificed not to ideology, but to media strategy. Horst Wessel died at 3:45 in the morning on February 23, 1930. The death certificate, filed with the Berlin Municipal Registry, lists the cause as septicemia secondary to gunshot wound. Dr. Magnus, in a 1946 denazification hearing, testified that Wessel might have survived with aggressive treatment in a sterile environment, but that such treatment had not been pursued. Whether that was due to medical resource constraints or Joseph's interference is unclear from the available records, but the effect was the same. Wessel died, and the death became the foundation of Nazi martyrology. Joseph organized the funeral for March 1, 1930, and it was a spectacle. 30,000 attendees, a procession through central Berlin, speeches framing Wessel as a Christ-like figure who had died for Germany's salvation. The eulogy Joseph delivered is preserved in audio recordings. "Germany, awaken! Horst Wessel has shown us the way." The language is apocalyptic, messianic, and it worked. The Horst Wessel song, a march that Wessel himself had written before his death, became the Nazi Party's anthem, sung at every rally and official function for the next 15 years. Erna Janicke, Wessel's girlfriend, was a prostitute. That detail was systematically erased from Nazi propaganda, which presented Wessel as a pure Aryan warrior. But Janicke attended the funeral, and a photographer captured her weeping at the graveside. Joseph ordered the photograph destroyed. A single print survived in Soviet archives, discovered in 1993. Janicke was the only person at that funeral who actually loved Horst Wessel as a human being rather than as a symbol, and she was erased because her presence complicated the mythology. The founding myth of the Third Reich, the story of the SA hero martyred by Judeo-Bolshevik criminals, cost $10 in unpaid rent and was built on the corpse of a 21-year-old who bled out from an infection that might have been treatable. That's the material reality underneath the propaganda, and it's worth remembering. Chapter 6. The Radio Weapon. In the Deutsches Museum archive in Munich, filed under DRA-1933-VE, there is a typed engineering memo from Otto Griesing, chief engineer at the German Radio Manufacturers Association, addressed to the Reich Ministry of Propaganda and dated April 2, 1933. The subject line reads, Frequency Limitations for Mass Market Receiver. Griesing writes, as specified, the VE301 tuner circuit will suppress signals below 150 meters wavelength, effectively eliminating reception of most foreign broadcasters. Per your directive, this limitation is not disclosed in consumer materials. In the margin, in Joseph Goebbels' handwriting, small, precise, slanting slightly to the right, is a single annotation. Excellent. The people will hear only us. This is not a radio. This is a weapon, engineered at the component level to ensure that the only information entering German homes is information that is passed through Joseph's ministry. The Volksempfänger VE301, People's Receiver, Model 301, the digits commemorating January 30th, 1933, the date of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, was unveiled at the Berlin Radio Exhibition on August 18, 1933. The price was 76 Reichsmarks, subsidized by the state to make it affordable to working-class families. For context, a standard consumer radio in 1933 cost between 200 and 300 Reichsmarks, placing it out of reach for most Germans. The Volksempfänger was priced at approximately 1 week's wages for a factory worker, which Joseph had calculated was the threshold between affordable and unavoidable. His speech at the radio exhibition, broadcast live and preserved in the Deutsches Rundfunkarchiv, announced, "Now every German home can hear the Führer's voice. The radio will do for the 20th century what the printing press did for the Reformation. It will unify the people under a single truth." What he didn't say, because it was hidden in the engineering specifications, was that the radio would also ensure they heard only the Führer's voice. The technical limitation Griesing describes, suppression of signals below 150 meters wavelength, which corresponds to frequencies above 2 megahertz, was not a cost-saving measure. It was a deliberate design choice that required specific component selection. The tuner circuit in the Volksempfänger used a single-stage RF amplifier with a fixed inductor-capacitor tank circuit. The inductor had a deliberately low Q factor, achieved by using higher resistance coils than would normally be specified for a radio of this type. The result was reduced sensitivity at shortwave frequencies, which is where most foreign broadcasters, BBC, Radio Moscow, stations in France and the Netherlands, transmitted. Griesing's private correspondence with fellow engineers, captured by Allied intelligence in 1945 and now archived in the National Archives in Washington under RG-242, admits, "The simplification narrative is false. We spent additional money to make the radio worse at receiving foreign signals. The ministry wanted censorship by design, and we delivered it. This is hardware-level information control, and it worked precisely because most consumers had no way of knowing what they weren't hearing." By December 1933, the regime had set a distribution target of 10 million radios in German homes by 1936. They exceeded that target, reaching 11.5 million units by 1935, making the Volksempfänger the most successful consumer electronics product in German history to that point. The distribution was not organic market adoption. It was a coordinated campaign involving subsidies, workplace purchase programs, and social pressure. Factory managers received directives from the German labor front to encourage workers to purchase radios, with the cost deducted directly from paychecks in installments. Schools received radios for classroom use, paid for through local education budgets. Community centers and public squares were equipped with loudspeakers connected to state radio feeds, ensuring that even people who didn't own radios were exposed to the broadcasts. Joseph called this system Gemeinschaftsempfang, collective listening, and it became mandatory in many workplaces. A photograph from 1934, archived in the Bundesarchiv, shows a Berlin factory floor. 400 workers standing in rows, all facing a single loudspeaker mounted on the wall, silent, listening to a speech by Hitler. This is the architecture of totalitarian attention. The content that flowed through the Volksempfänger was tightly controlled. On January 30, 1933, Joseph's first directive as Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda was to place all radio stations under state control by February 1st. Germany in 1933 had multiple regional radio broadcasters, each with its own programming and editorial independence. Joseph eliminated that independence within 48 hours, replacing station directors with party loyalists and centralizing all programming decisions through the ministry in Berlin. By March 1933, every radio station in Germany was broadcasting the same content at the same time. News bulletins written by ministry staff, speeches by Hitler and other party leaders, carefully curated music that avoided degenerate influences, and serialized propaganda dramas that presented Nazi ideology through fictional narratives. There was no channel surfing, no alternative programming, because there were no alternatives. The Volksempfänger had a single tuning dial, and every frequency it could receive carried the same message. The system's effectiveness is documented in Gestapo reports from the late 30s, which tracked illegal radio modifications as a form of political dissent. In 1935, the Gestapo reported approximately 1,500 arrests annually for the crime of modifying Volksempfänger radios to receive foreign broadcasts. The modification was technically simple. It required adding a single coil and capacitor to extend the frequency range, parts that cost about 2 Reichsmarks. But the penalty was severe, up to 5 years in prison under the Rundfunkgesetz, the broadcasting law, which classified unauthorized reception of foreign radio as a form of treason. The fact that people risked imprisonment to hear the BBC tells you everything about the value of information in a closed system. They weren't modifying the radios out of ideological opposition to the regime. They were doing it because they wanted to know what was actually happening in the world. And they understood that the Volksempfänger was feeding them a curated version of reality. When I hold a schematic diagram of the VE301, Otto Griesing's original engineering drawings are preserved in the Deutsches Museum, I feel a cold precision. This is not a radio designed to inform. It's a radio designed to limit, to constrain, to ensure that the informational diet of an entire nation passes through a single ideological filter. Joseph understood something we're still grappling with in the 21st century. Control the medium, and the message controls itself. You don't need to ban foreign radio if the radio physically can't receive it. You don't need to censor newspapers if you control who gets a printing license. The architecture of information is the architecture of power, and Joseph built that architecture with the same meticulous attention to detail that an engineer applies to a bridge or a dam. The Volksempfänger was not propaganda. It was infrastructure for propaganda, and infrastructure is harder to dismantle than content. Chapters 7 through 12 continue in the next installment. Chapters 7 through 12 continue in the next installment. Chapter 7. Lenny and the Lens. In the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, filed under R55/663, there is a budget requisition form dated August 3, 1934, signed by Leni Riefenstahl in a clear, confident hand. The requisition requests 60,000 Reichsmarks for specialized camera equipment and track installation at the Nuremberg rally grounds. In the margin, Joseph Goebbels has written in his characteristic slanting script, "Denied, excessive, use standard newsreel cameras." Below that notation, in different ink and dated August 5th, is a rubber stamp that reads, "Approved by order of the Führer, JG objection overruled." This single document tells you everything about the power dynamic that governed the production of Triumph of the Will. Joseph lost. Hitler had chosen the artist over the bureaucrat, and Joseph, who was accustomed to controlling every aspect of Nazi media, found himself sidelined by a woman whose understanding of cinema exceeded his own. The film that resulted would become the most iconic piece of Nazi propaganda ever created, and Joseph's absence from its production, his inability to impose his vision on Riefenstahl's, haunted him for years. Leni Riefenstahl was 32 years old in May 1934 when Joseph offered her the commission to direct a documentary of the Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg. She was already a successful actress and director, known for mountain films and experimental techniques that placed her at the forefront of German cinema's technical avant-garde. The offer came with a contract that specified complete artistic control, a phrase that Joseph agreed to without apparent hesitation, assuming he could override her decisions during production if necessary. He was wrong. Riefenstahl accepted the commission but insisted on provisions that gave her final authority over crew selection, equipment purchases, and editorial decisions in post-production. The contract, preserved in the Bundesarchiv under Riefenstahl's personal file, includes a clause stipulated by her lawyer. The director's creative decisions are final and not subject to ministry review except by direct order of the Führer. Joseph signed it, likely assuming Hitler would never intervene. He underestimated both Riefenstahl's relationship with Hitler and Hitler's intuitive understanding that propaganda required spectacle, not accounting. The 1934 Nuremberg Rally, officially titled the Rally of Unity and Strength, took place from September 4th through September 10th, and Riefenstahl's crew arrived on site a week early to prepare. The production logistics were extraordinary. She employed 36 cameramen, 16 of them equipped with telephoto lenses that had been custom manufactured for the shoot. She ordered the construction of camera tracks, wooden rails mounted on steel frames, that allowed for moving shots impossible with static tripods. One track was 20 meters long, positioned directly in front of the main speaker's podium, and its presence was visible to the rally attendees, a distraction that Joseph found intolerable. His objection, documented in a heated exchange recorded in production notes kept by Walter Trout, the production accountant, was that the track distracts from the Führer and makes the event look staged. Riefenstahl's response, according to Trout's notes, "It is staged. My job is to make it look like destiny." The argument escalated. Joseph threatened to shut down production. Riefenstahl threatened to quit and appealed directly to Hitler. Hitler sided with Riefenstahl. The track stayed, and the resulting shot, Hitler walking toward the camera with towering banners behind him, the camera retreating smoothly on the rails, became one of the most reproduced images in the history of political cinema. Joseph's diary from September 1934 contains multiple references to the Nuremberg production, and the tone oscillates between admiration and resentment. On September 7th, he writes, "Leni is a genius, but impossible. She demands perfection in every frame, every angle. She treats the rally as raw material for her vision, not as a political event to be documented." On September 9th, "Watched the filming today. She directs the cameraman like a general. Hitler watches her work and smiles. I feel superfluous." The word superfluous is telling. Joseph, who had spent the previous 8 years building the Nazi propaganda apparatus, who controlled newspapers, radio, film production budgets, and press credentials, was watching a woman with no party affiliation and no ideological commitment outperform him in the medium he believed he had mastered. Riefenstahl's production notes, preserved in her personal archive and later donated to the Berlin Film Museum, reveal that Joseph visited the Nuremberg set exactly twice during the 6 days of filming. Riefenstahl was on site for 12-hour days throughout. The film was hers, not his, and everyone involved understood that. The budget crisis came in December 1934, when Trout submitted his final accounting report to the ministry. The initial budget for Triumph of the Will had been 140,000 Reichmarks. The final cost was 280,000 Reichmarks, a 200% overrun. Joseph demanded cuts, insisting that certain scenes be removed to reduce post-production expenses. Riefenstahl refused, and once again appealed to Hitler. Hitler approved additional funding without hesitation. Trout's memo, dated December 18, 1934, and filed in the Bundesarchiv under the production's financial records, notes, "Minister Goebbels is losing control of this project. The Führer has granted Riefenstahl autonomy that supersedes ministry authority. Recommend future projects include clearer contractual limits on directorial discretion." The recommendation was never implemented. Hitler understood what Joseph apparently didn't: that Triumph of the Will required artistic vision, not bureaucratic oversight, and that Riefenstahl's vision was producing something far more powerful than anything Joseph's ministry could script. The film premiered on March 28, 1935, at the Ufa Palast am Zoo in Berlin, with Hitler, Riefenstahl, and the party leadership in attendance. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics, even those outside Germany, recognized the film as a technical and aesthetic achievement. It won the German Film Prize, and Riefenstahl was awarded the prize personally by Hitler in a ceremony that Joseph attended but did not speak at. His diary entry from that night is brief and bitter. "Leni has created something extraordinary. She understands images in a way I do not. This troubles me. It should have troubled him." Triumph of the Will proved that propaganda could transcend the transactional, message-driven approach Joseph had perfected in newspapers and radio. Riefenstahl's film didn't argue for Nazism. It presented Nazism as aesthetically inevitable, as a visual and auditory experience that bypassed rational critique entirely. The film's power lay not in its content, but in its form. The hypnotic rhythm of marching columns, the sweeping aerial shots that transformed human beings into abstract patterns, the manipulation of light and shadow that made Hitler appear to descend from the clouds like a deity. What strikes me when I watch Triumph of the Will, and I've watched it multiple times, always with a sense of unease, is Joseph's absence from the film's DNA. His propaganda was always verbal, always transactional, always asking the audience to accept a specific claim or reject a specific enemy. Riefenstahl's propaganda was ambient, atmospheric, asking nothing and asserting everything through the accumulation of images. She made Nazism beautiful, and beauty is harder to argue against than rhetoric. Joseph understood this, and it terrified him, because it suggested he was replaceable. In 1936, he attempted to have Riefenstahl expelled from the Reich film chamber by leaking rumors that she had Jewish ancestry. The Gestapo conducted an investigation. The file was discovered in 1998 in a Prague archive and found no evidence. The file includes a notation. Minister Goebbels requested this inquiry. Finding: no Jewish heritage. Case closed. It was a failed purge disguised as racial diligence, and it tells you how threatened Joseph felt by a woman whose mastery of the image exceeded his mastery of the word. Chapter 8. The Ministry Machine. The organizational chart of the Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, dated January 1937, spans 11 pages of densely typed bureaucratic structure. The chart is preserved in the Bundesarchiv under file R55/20, and it lists 14 major departments, 47 subdepartments, and 1,902 employees by name, identification number, and functional role. Every department, radio, press, film, theater, music, literature, foreign press, domestic propaganda, visual arts, connects via a red line to a single box at the center of the chart labeled Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels. At the bottom of the final page, someone, presumably Joseph, has written in pen, "All roads lead to me." This is not a ministry in the traditional sense of a government bureau with delegated authorities and semi-autonomous divisions. This is a hub-and-spoke dictatorship rendered in organizational architecture, designed to ensure that no information flows through Germany without passing through Joseph's desk or the desks of subordinates who report directly to him. Joseph inherited a staff of 0 when the ministry was created on March 13, 1933. By December of that year, the ministry employed 350 people. By January 1936, the number had grown to 1,902. By 1942, it exceeded 3,000. This rate of expansion outpaced every other Nazi government agency except the SS. For comparison, the Reich Ministry of Economics, responsible for managing the entire German industrial base, employed 1,200 people in 1937. The Reich Ministry of Justice employed 980. Joseph built a larger bureaucracy for controlling information than Germany had for managing its economy or legal system. Propaganda was infrastructure, and Joseph understood that infrastructure requires personnel, budgets, organizational hierarchies, and the kind of procedural routines that make control automatic rather than exceptional. The hiring philosophy that governed ministry staffing is visible in personnel files, thousands of which survived the war and are now archived in the Bundesarchiv. A representative example is the file of Hans Fritzsche, a radio commentator who was promoted to head the radio division in 1936. Joseph's handwritten evaluation, attached to Fritzsche's promotion paperwork, reads, "Reliable. No independent thoughts? Perfect." This was not an insult. It was the ideal. Joseph did not want subordinates who challenged him or brought alternative perspectives. He wanted competent executors who would implement directives without question. Ideology was assumed. Compliance was rewarded. The personnel files contain hundreds of similar evaluations, and the pattern is consistent. Technical skill plus obedience equals advancement. Creativity, independent judgment, or ideological zeal beyond the functional minimum were liabilities, not assets. The ministry was a machine, and machines require interchangeable parts, not artisans. One of the ministry's most consequential innovations was the Reichskulturkammer, the Reich Chamber of Culture, a system of compulsory professional guilds that controlled access to employment in all cultural fields. The chamber was divided into 7 subchambers: film, music, theater, press, writing, fine arts, and radio. Every person who worked in any of these fields, actors, directors, journalists, authors, painters, musicians, cameramen, stagehands, makeup artists, was required to join their respective chamber and undergo racial and political reliability checks. Those who failed the checks, or who were denied membership for any reason, were barred from employment. The system was established by decree in September 1933, and by 1935 it had enrolled over 300,000 members. The public justification, articulated in ministry press releases, was ensuring quality and professionalism in German culture. The internal logic, documented in a leaked memo that reached SPD exiles in Prague in 1938, was simpler. Total employment control. No one works in film, press, or radio without our approval. Joseph had effectively privatized censorship by making it a prerequisite for employment rather than a reactive punishment for transgression. The daily operation of the ministry's control apparatus is best documented in the Daily Press Directive System, one of the least publicized but most effective tools Joseph developed. Every morning at 11 o'clock, representatives from every major German newspaper attended a briefing at the ministry's press office on Wilhelmplatz in Berlin. They received a typed memo, typically 2 to 4 pages, specifying which stories to cover, which stories to ignore, what language to use, and what angle to emphasize. These directives were legally binding under the Schriftleiter Gesetz, the editor's law of October 1933, which redefined journalism as a public trust subject to state oversight. A representative directive, preserved in the Bundesarchiv under file R55/421, dated April 9, 1936, reads, "All newspapers will describe the Rhineland remilitarization as a defensive measure necessitated by French treaty violations. The word invasion is forbidden. Emphasis on popular support and peaceful intentions." Joseph didn't censor the press in the traditional sense of reviewing and redacting content after it was written. He scripted it in advance, ensuring that the initial framing, the first draft of history, was his. The system's redundancy was deliberate. Every department within the ministry had overlapping jurisdiction with at least one other department, ensuring that no single subordinate controlled a complete pipeline from content creation to distribution. The radio division controlled broadcast content, but the propaganda division controlled messaging themes. The film division controlled production budgets, but the foreign press division controlled international distribution. The press division controlled newspaper content, but the literature division controlled book publishing, which included serialized stories that often originated in newspapers. When I trace the connections in the ministry's organizational charts, I see architectural paranoia. No one except Joseph could see the whole picture, and that was intentional. Subordinates could be competent within their domains, but they could never accumulate enough authority to threaten Joseph's position. This is not just bureaucracy. It's fractal control, designed to prevent rivals from emerging within the apparatus. The ministry's reach extended beyond media production into distribution and retail. In 1937, Joseph commissioned an internal study, never published, discovered in 1952 in a ministry file cache, measuring propaganda penetration, defined as the percentage of Germans exposed to state messaging daily through any medium. The results? 87% via radio, 62% via newspapers, 41% via newsreels shown in cinemas. Joseph's handwritten note in the margin. Goal: 100% via all channels by 1940. Total saturation. No German should end a day without encountering the Führer's message. He was engineering ubiquity, and the infrastructure to achieve it was already in place by the late 30s. When the war began in September 1939, the ministry didn't need to build a wartime propaganda apparatus. It simply repurposed the infrastructure that had been constructed to control peacetime culture. Chapter 9. Magda. In the Hoover Institution archive at Stanford University, filed under Box M. Goebbels 12, there is a letter from Magda Quandt, her surname before her marriage to Joseph, dated October 15, 1930. The letter is written on heavy cream stationery with a blue fountain pen, the handwriting elegant and precise. It reads, "I understand what you require. A wife who understands the movement and can represent it publicly. I can do this. But you must understand what I require. Total financial security and social position. We can help each other. This is not a love letter. This is a contract negotiation." And both parties understood it as such. At the bottom of the page, in Joseph's handwriting, is a reply that was never sent, but was kept in his files. Agreed. We will build this together. The marriage that followed was many things: public performance, ideological partnership, mutual exploitation, but it was not, at its core, a romance. It was a co-production. and both Joseph and Magda played their roles with the discipline of actors who understand that leaving the stage means losing everything. Magda Ritschl was born on November 11, 1891, into a lower-middle-class family in Berlin. Her early life was unstable. Her biological father, Oskar Ritschl, was an engineer who had little involvement in her upbringing, and her mother, Auguste, remarried when Magda was a child. Magda's stepfather, Richard Friedlander, was a Jewish businessman, and Magda spent much of her adolescence in his household, a detail that the Nazi propaganda apparatus later worked to erase. She was educated in Catholic convent schools, spoke fluent French, and presented herself as cultured and cosmopolitan in a way that marked her as upper middle class even when her finances were precarious. In 1921, she married Gunther Quandt, a wealthy industrialist 30 years her senior, and the marriage produced one son, Harold. The marriage was cold. By all accounts, Quandt was emotionally distant, but it provided Magda with the financial security and social status she craved. When the marriage ended in divorce in 1929, Magda received a generous settlement that left her financially independent, and she began attending Nazi party rallies, initially out of curiosity rather than conviction. She met Joseph in November 1930 at a party function in Berlin. He was Gauleiter of Berlin, ambitious, articulate, and conspicuously disabled in a movement that fetishized physical perfection. She was a divorced socialite with a son, financially secure but socially unmoored, searching for a role that would give her life structure and meaning. They circled each other for weeks before Joseph proposed, and the proposal was framed explicitly in transactional terms. Magda's diary from this period, fragments of which were preserved and are now archived in the Bundesarchiv, includes an entry from December 1930. He is brilliant, but damaged. He needs someone who can present the domestic ideal he cannot embody himself. I need purpose. This could work. Dr. Karl Brandt, who would later become the Goebbels family physician, attended their wedding on December 19, 1931, and later wrote in his private notes, "I have attended many weddings. This one felt like a press conference." The wedding was a media event. Hitler served as best man, a signal to the party that Joseph had the Führer's personal endorsement. The ceremony was filmed for newsreels, and Magda wore a white gown that was photographed from every angle and reproduced in newspapers across Germany. Joseph wore his SA uniform. The press coverage emphasized Magda's elegance, her devotion to the movement, and her role as the ideal Nazi wife, supportive, refined, committed to family and Führer. What the coverage omitted was that Magda had negotiated the terms of the marriage with the precision of a corporate merger. She would manage the household, bear children, and represent the regime publicly. Joseph would provide financial security, social prestige, and a role in history. Both parties would maintain appearances regardless of private realities. The marriage contract was unwritten, but it was binding. The first child, Helga, was born on September 1, 1932, and Joseph ensured that photographers were present at the hospital. The newspapers ran stories celebrating the birth of an Aryan daughter, and Magda was presented as the embodiment of Nazi motherhood. Her medical file from that birth, preserved in the hospital's archive, notes, "Severe postpartum hemorrhaging, required transfusion." But none of this appeared in the press. The brand was motherhood. The reality was blood loss. 5 more children followed between 1934 and 1940. Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, Haida. All 6 names began with the letter H, for Hitler, a branding decision that Magda later claimed was her idea, but which Joseph's diary suggests he insisted upon. The children were not just a family, they were content, photographed constantly, featured in propaganda films and newspaper spreads as the ideal Nazi household. The marriage began to fracture publicly in 1934, when Joseph began an affair with Lida Barova, a Czech film actress. The affair was not discreet. Magda's diary entries from August 1934, preserved in fragments, record her awareness and her calculation. He is with her again, I know. But what can I do? Leave? And become irrelevant? Joseph's diary from the same period claims, "Magda is understanding. She knows my needs. One of them is lying. or both are performing for posterity, but the effect is the same. The marriage continued because both parties had too much invested in the performance to walk away. Dr. Brandt, who treated Magda for what his files describe as chronic depression and marital strain, noted in September 1934 that Magda was taking sedatives daily and that her public appearances require significant pre-event medication to manage anxiety. She was chemically sustained through the performance. The crisis came in August 1938, when Magda, humiliated by Joseph's increasingly public relationship with Barova, threatened to divorce him and appealed directly to Hitler. Hitler was furious, not at the infidelity, but at the scandal it was causing within the party. He summoned Joseph and ordered him to end the affair immediately, threatening to remove him from office if he refused. Joseph complied, not out of love for Magda, but because Hitler's threat was credible. Dr. Brandt's notes from September 1938. Saw Magda today. She is taking increased doses of luminol, phenobarbital. She said, "I won the battle, but lost the marriage." She understands this is no longer a partnership. It is a performance we are both trapped in. In October 1938, Joseph and Magda appeared together at the Harvest Festival in Buckeberg, holding hands for photographers. Dr. Brandt, present in the medical tent, wrote, "They barely spoke to each other before the cameras arrived. Once the cameras were on, they transformed. This is not marriage. This is acting." What disturbs me most when I read Magda's letters, especially the early ones before the children, when she still had the option to leave, is the cold pragmatism that mirrors Joseph's own. In a 1936 letter to her mother, seized by Allied forces in 1945, Magda writes, "Joseph is who he is. I knew this when I married him. I chose this. The children are mine. The marriage is ours. The performance is for Germany. I can separate these things. This is my power." She wasn't a victim. She was a collaborator with open eyes, and that makes her final act, the murder of their 6 children in the Führer bunker in April 1945, even more incomprehensible. She had spent 15 years performing a role, separating private reality from public image, and then, in the end, she collapsed that distinction entirely, killing the children to preserve the mythology. Whether that was ideology or the final act of the performance is a question I cannot answer. Chapter 10. Kristallnacht and the Scripted Pogrom. In the Allianz Insurance Archive in Munich, filed under KN-1938-267, there is a damage claim submitted on November 12, 1938, by Herr Abraham Meyerstein, owner of a textile shop at Grosse Hamburger Strasse 19 in Berlin. The claim lists 4 display windows shattered, 1 front door destroyed, inventory looted, estimated value 8,400 Reichsmarks. At the bottom of the form, stamped in red ink, is the denial. Claim denied. Reich Decree, November 12, 38. Jewish property owners ineligible for compensation. Below that, in pencil, the assessor Otto Schindhelm has written, "This is theft with paperwork." Schindhelm was a senior claims assessor at Allianz, and over the course of November and December 1938, he processed thousands of claims from Jewish property owners whose businesses and homes had been destroyed during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. His internal memos, preserved in the Allianz corporate archive, reveal that he understood immediately that the spontaneous pogrom was orchestrated, because the damage patterns were too uniform, too coordinated, too precisely timed to be the result of unorganized mob violence. The trigger event occurred on November 7, 1938, in Paris, when Herschel Grinspan, a 17-year-old Polish-Jewish refugee, walked into the German embassy and shot Ernst vom Rath, a low-level diplomat. Grinspan's motives were personal. His parents had been deported from Germany to Poland and were living in squalid conditions in a border camp. But the shooting provided Joseph with exactly the pretext he had been waiting for. Vom Rath was wounded but initially survived, and Joseph monitored his condition closely. On November 9th, Vom Rath died. That evening, Joseph was in Munich attending a Nazi party gathering to commemorate the anniversary of the beer hall putsch. At 9 o'clock, he gave a speech announcing Vom Rath's death and suggesting that the German people might respond with justified anger that the party would not organize, but also would not prevent. This was a green light disguised as restraint. Within 2 hours, SA and SS units across Germany received orders. The orders were later destroyed, but their existence is confirmed in post-war interrogations of SA commanders. To attack Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes while wearing civilian clothes to maintain the appearance of spontaneous popular outrage. The pogrom executed with mechanical precision. Otto Schindhelm's internal memo to Allianz management, dated November 15, 1938, notes, "Damage patterns indicate coordinated action. Multiple synagogues in different cities burned at approximately the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Windows shattered in commercial districts across Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Munich within the same 90-minute window. This suggests central coordination, not spontaneous action." He was correct. The Gestapo's own internal reports, compiled after the pogrom and discovered by Allied forces in 1945, list 267 synagogues destroyed, 7,500 Jewish businesses vandalized, 91 Jews murdered, the official count, though the actual number was certainly higher, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. The statistical precision of these numbers tells you that someone was counting, tracking, coordinating. This was not a riot. It was an operation. The financial dimension of Kristallnacht is where Joseph's role becomes most visible. On November 10th, the Reich Security Main Office compiled preliminary damage estimates. 25 million Reichsmarks in destroyed Jewish-owned property. This property was now effectively ownerless under German law, ripe for expropriation. On November 12th, Hermann Göring convened a conference with Joseph and other senior officials to discuss the Jewish question in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. The meeting minutes, preserved in the Nuremberg trial archives, document the decisions. Jews would pay a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks as atonement for the assassination of vom Rath. Additionally, all insurance payouts to Jewish property owners would be confiscated by the state. Joseph's contribution to the meeting, recorded in the minutes. The propaganda value has been achieved. Now we extract the economic value. The pogrom had return on investment. Otto Schindhelm's job became processing the mechanics of this expropriation. Jewish property owners submitted insurance claims under their standard policies, which technically covered damages from vandalism and fire. Allianz and other insurers calculated the payouts, approximately 225 million Reichsmarks in total. But the November 12th decree redirected all payments to the Reich government rather than to the policyholders. Schindhelm's memo from December 2, 1938. "We are functioning as a wealth transfer mechanism. Jewish policyholders submit claims. We assess them. We pay the Reich. The policyholders receive nothing. This is legalized theft executed through insurance bureaucracy." Schindhelm was later arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 for defeatist remarks unrelated to Kristallnacht, but he survived the war and testified about the insurance confiscation process at denazification hearings. Joseph's diary entry from November 10, 1938, is remarkably candid. "The Führer has decided the Jews must be driven out of the economy entirely. Last night was just the beginning. The propaganda has served its purpose. Now comes the structural work." This entry reveals that Kristallnacht was not the climax of anti-Jewish policy, but the opening move in economic annihilation. The violence was marketing for dispossession. When I map the timing of synagogue fires across Germany, Hamburg at 2:14 in the morning, Frankfurt at 2:20, Munich at 2:35, I see the signature of coordination. These weren't mobs. These were units executing a timetable. Joseph called it spontaneous. I call it logistics. The lie was structural, built into the operation from the beginning, and it worked because most Germans either believed the official narrative or found it convenient to pretend they did. The international response to Kristallnacht was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. American and British newspapers ran front-page stories condemning the violence. President Roosevelt recalled the U.S. ambassador from Berlin in protest. But within Germany, the ministry's propaganda apparatus moved swiftly to control the narrative. The Daily Press Directive from November 11, 1938, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, instructed newspapers, coverage of recent events will emphasize 1. Popular anger was justified response to Jewish crime. 2. Damage was minimal and order has been restored. 3. International criticism is evidence of Jewish control of foreign press. 4. The German people stand united behind the Führer. The directive was followed uniformly. German newspapers published identical framing, and within 72 hours the domestic narrative had been sealed. Joseph had orchestrated a national pogrom with bureaucratic precision, extracted 1 billion Reichsmarks from its victims, and convinced much of the German public that they had witnessed righteous justice rather than state-sponsored theft and violence. Chapter 11. The war begins, the lies begin. In the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, filed under RH-2/V.267, there is a Wehrmacht casualty report from the Poland campaign, compiled by the General Staff and dated October 8, 1939. The report lists total German dead, 16,343, wounded, 27,280, missing, 3,404. 3 days later, on October 11th, the Völkischer Beobachter, the official Nazi Party newspaper, published Joseph Goebbels' approved figures. Approximately 10,000 German heroes have fallen in the liberation of our eastern territories. Someone in the General Staff, whose identity is not recorded, clipped the newspaper article and attached it to the internal casualty report with a handwritten note in the margin. Why are we understating our own success? It's an excellent question, and the answer reveals everything about the logic governing Joseph's propaganda as Germany entered the war. The lies were not situational responses to military setbacks. They were structural, baked into the system from the first day of combat, even when the truth would have been more impressive than the fabrication. The war began at 4:45 in the morning on September 1, 1939, when German forces crossed the Polish border at multiple points along a front stretching from East Prussia to Slovakia. Joseph announced the invasion via radio at 5:30, and the prepared text, preserved in the Deutsches Rundfunkarchiv, framed the attack as a defensive response to Polish aggression. The Führer has been forced to act against Polish provocations that have threatened the lives of ethnic Germans and violated the sovereignty of the Reich. The specific provocation cited was the Gleiwitz incident, an alleged attack by Polish forces on a German radio station near the border on the night of August 31st. The incident was fabricated. SS operatives dressed in Polish uniforms staged the attack, and the bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed as Polish soldiers were left at the scene as evidence. Major Helmuth Grosskirch, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer who compiled internal casualty and operational reports for the General Staff, wrote in his diary on September 2nd, "The Gleiwitz story is fabricated. Everyone in the General Staff knows this, but the press is publishing it as fact. We are starting the war with a lie, and this sets a precedent." The Poland campaign lasted 36 days and resulted in a decisive German victory. The Wehrmacht's operational performance was efficient. Mechanized units advanced rapidly, air superiority was established within 48 hours, and Polish resistance collapsed under the combined pressure of German forces from the west and Soviet forces from the east after September 17th. The casualty figures documented in the General Staff's internal reports reflect a successful campaign. 16,343 German dead out of approximately 1.5 million soldiers deployed represents roughly a 1% fatality rate, well below the rates experienced in the First World War. Joseph could have published these figures accurately and used them to demonstrate German military superiority. Instead, he reduced the count by 38%, publishing 10,000 dead rather than 16,000. Major Grosskirch's diary entry from October 12, 1939. Why minimize our losses when we won decisively? The truth would be more impressive. unless the ministry believes any casualty number is a propaganda risk, in which case we have established a pattern. Never publish accurate loss figures, even when favorable. The France campaign in May and June 1940 reinforced this pattern. The German invasion of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands began on May 10, 1940, and by June 22, France had signed an armistice. The campaign lasted 6 weeks and is still studied in military academies as one of the most decisive victories in modern warfare. German casualties, according to Wehrmacht Medical Service records compiled in July 1940 and archived in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv under RH8, totaled approximately 27,074 dead and 111,000 wounded. Joseph's ministry published figures of fewer than 15,000 fallen heroes in newspapers and radio broadcasts. The undercount was 45%. Grosskreutz, by now deeply cynical about ministry reporting, wrote in his diary on June 30, 1940, "We achieved the impossible, defeated France in 6 weeks, and the ministry is still lying about our casualties." This suggests the lies are structural, not situational. The system cannot tell the truth because it is committed to a version of reality that requires constant curation. The visual propaganda of victory was equally manipulated. On July 18, 1940, Joseph organized a massive victory parade through Berlin to celebrate the defeat of France. The newsreels, produced under ministry supervision and distributed to cinemas across Germany and occupied Europe, show enormous crowds lining Unter den Linden, cheering as Wehrmacht units marched past. The footage is impressive, but cameraman Walter Frenz, whose private notes survived the war and are archived in the Bundesarchiv, recorded the techniques used to enhance the visual impact. Goebbels ordered us to shoot from low angles to make the crowds appear larger than they were. He also instructed us to film the same crowd sections multiple times from different angles, then edit the footage to suggest greater numbers and more widespread enthusiasm. The crowd was substantial, perhaps 50,000, but not the 100,000 the newsreels suggest. Even in triumph, the image required manipulation. Joseph's diary entry from December 1940 reflects on the propaganda strategy that had governed the first 16 months of war. The Führer understands. Propaganda must create a reality more compelling than actual reality. Truth is whatever serves the movement. This is not dishonesty. This is artistry. The people do not need facts. They need faith. And faith is built through narrative consistency, not empirical accuracy. This is the totalitarian epistemological break rendered explicit. Truth becomes subordinate to narrative, and the propagandist's job is not to report reality, but to construct a version of reality that serves ideological and strategic goals. What disturbs me about this formulation is not its cynicism — Joseph was always cynical — but its preemptive quality. He was lying during victories, before there were defeats to conceal, which tells me the lies were never about outcomes. They were about control. Once the regime committed to a propagandized version of reality, reverting to truth would mean admitting the entire apparatus was fraudulent. The system had to keep lying, even when the truth would have sufficed. British intelligence, intercepting German communications and cross-referencing them with other intelligence sources, realized by mid-1940 that Germany was systematically undercounting casualties in press releases. A British intelligence memo from August 1940, declassified in 1975 and now archived at the National Archives in Kew, notes, "The enemy appears to lie reflexively, even when truth would serve them better. Their casualty figures are consistently understated by 30 to 50%, even following victories. This suggests the lies are pathological rather than strategic, which may be an exploitable weakness. If they cannot tell the truth even when winning, their credibility will collapse entirely when they begin losing." The British were correct. The infrastructure of lies that Joseph built during the victory years would become unsustainable once the Eastern Front turned into a charnel house. But in 1940, with France defeated and Britain isolated, the lies seemed cost-free. Reality had not yet sent the bill. Chapter 12. The Soviet Collision. In the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, filed under RH21/2-498, there is a supply report from Colonel Ernst Günther Bade, logistics officer with Army Group Center, dated December 7, 1941. The report is typed on a manual typewriter, the letters slightly faded, and it reads: Current temperature, minus 38 degrees Celsius. Winter clothing has not arrived. Frostbite casualties now exceed combat casualties. 60% of our vehicles are inoperable due to cold. The men are using straw and newspapers as insulation. They are listening to Goebbels on the radio, telling them about our victorious advance. Morale is disintegrating. In the margin, someone, presumably a general staff officer reviewing the report, has written in pencil, "How do we spin this?" The answer, as it turned out, was that you couldn't. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, destroyed Joseph's propaganda model because it produced a gap between official narrative and lived experience that was too large to bridge. Soldiers knew they were freezing and dying, and no radio speech could convince them otherwise. Operation Barbarossa launched at 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, with over 3 million German soldiers crossing the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Joseph announced the invasion via radio at 5:30, using language that framed the operation as a preemptive defensive strike. The Führer has been forced to act against the Judeo-Bolshevik menace that threatens all of Europe. German soldiers march not as conquerors, but as liberators, freeing the Russian people from communist tyranny. The messaging was confident, triumphant, and built on the assumption, shared by most of the Wehrmacht High Command, that the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. Colonel Bade, crossing the border with Army Group Center's logistics units on June 22, wrote in his personal diary, "We are advancing rapidly. The Red Army seems disorganized, and we are capturing huge numbers of prisoners. But the logistical plan assumes victory by September. If the campaign extends into winter, we have no preparation. No winter clothing has been stockpiled." This feels reckless. The initial advances were spectacular. German armored spearheads penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, encircling entire Soviet armies and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By late July, Army Group Center had reached Smolensk, 2/3 of the way to Moscow. Joseph's radio addresses during this period described an unstoppable march toward total victory, and the newsreels showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners and captured equipment. But the logistical reality, documented in supply reports that Bade and other logistics officers filed weekly with the General Staff, was deteriorating. The Soviet rail gauge was wider than the European standard, which meant that German trains could not operate on captured Soviet rail lines until the tracks were physically converted, a process that required labor, materials, and time. Fuel consumption was higher than anticipated because distances were vast and road conditions were poor. Food supplies were stretched thin because German planning had assumed the army would requisition food from occupied Soviet territories, but the scorched earth tactics employed by retreating Soviet forces left little to requisition. In October 1941, the autumn rains began, and the dirt roads that German vehicles relied on, paved roads were rare in the Western Soviet Union, turned into impassable mud. This period, known as Rasputitsa, or mud season, is documented extensively in German logistics reports. Bade's report from October 18, 1941, "Supply trucks are sinking to their axles. We are abandoning vehicles because we cannot extract them. We are consuming supplies faster than we can deliver them. Fuel stocks at division level are critically low. We are winning battles but losing the map." The phrase, "losing the map," is striking. It suggests Bade understood that tactical victories were becoming operationally meaningless if the army could not sustain forward momentum. Joseph's radio broadcasts from this period continued to describe the campaign in triumphant terms, but the gap between his messaging and the reality documented in field reports was widening. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet winter counteroffensive began. Soviet forces, equipped with winter clothing and vehicles designed to operate in extreme cold, launched coordinated attacks along the entire front near Moscow. German units, many of which had been fighting continuously for 5 months and were now facing temperatures that routinely dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, began retreating. The retreat was not orderly. Vehicles froze and were abandoned. Soldiers suffered frostbite in numbers that exceeded combat casualties. Bod's diary entry from December 8, 1941. We are retreating. Engines freeze. Men freeze. This is not the strategic repositioning that Berlin is describing. This is survival. The temperature last night was minus 42 Celsius. We lost more men to cold than to Soviet fire. Joseph's radio address on December 8th described the situation as strategic repositioning to strengthen our lines for the final assault on Moscow. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, and Joseph was still describing it as an advance. The propaganda crisis forced Joseph to pivot. On December 20th, 1941, he launched the Winterhilfswerk campaign, Winter Relief, asking German civilians to donate warm clothing, blankets, and other supplies for soldiers on the Eastern Front. The campaign was framed as patriotic sacrifice, but it was an implicit admission that the regime had failed to prepare for winter. Bod's diary entry from December 25, 1941. The fact that Berlin is asking civilians for scarves and mittens tells you everything about our logistics planning. We invaded a continental power in June without ensuring we had winter uniforms in October. This is not strategy. This is negligence. Between December 1941 and March 1942, the Wehrmacht suffered approximately 228,000 frostbite casualties, according to medical service records archived in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv under RH-12. This figure exceeded combat casualties, 180,000 dead, for the same period. The Wehrmacht lost more soldiers to winter than to the Red Army, and Joseph had no narrative for this. How do you propagandize a thermometer? The mechanical failures caused by extreme cold are documented in technical reports filed by Wehrmacht maintenance units. German vehicles used standard petroleum-based lubricants that froze solid below minus 25 degrees Celsius. Tank engines required open-flame preheating for up to 4 hours before they could be started, a process that was dangerous, time-consuming, and often failed. Locomotives hauling supply trains froze to the tracks. Boda's January 1942 report includes detailed technical failures. Our Panzer IIIs have a 70% mechanical failure rate, primarily due to transmission lubricant crystallization. Artillery pieces cannot be repositioned because the ground is frozen too hard for entrenchment, and the hydraulic recoil systems have frozen. Rifles jam because bolt mechanisms freeze. We are fighting a war against temperature as much as against the Red Army. When I read Boda's temperature logs, he recorded the daily low temperature from October 1941 through March 1942, I see a graphic chart of Joseph's failure. As the temperature line drops, the propaganda becomes more frantic and abstract. By January 1942, Joseph is talking about eternal German spirit, because he has nothing material left to reference. In April 1942, Joseph commissioned an internal study, never published and discovered in 1948 in a ministry file cache, surveying German soldiers on home leave about, quote, morale factors. The top response, documented in the study's summary, ministry radio addresses are perceived as disconnected from frontline reality. Soldiers report that official descriptions of the Eastern Front do not match their experiences. Credibility of ministry information is declining among frontline personnel. Joseph's own research told him the soldiers didn't believe him anymore. He suppressed the study and continued the radio addresses anyway, because stopping would mean admitting the propaganda had failed. The system had to keep broadcasting, even when the audience had stopped listening. Chapters 13 through 17 continue in the next installment. Chapter 13. Total War and the Sportpalast. In the Deutsches Rundfunkarchiv in Potsdam-Babelsberg, filed under DRA-SPT-1943-02, there is a typed production memo from Heinrich Glassmeyer, audio engineer for Reichsrundfunk, addressed to the Reich Radio Technical Staff and dated February 16, 1943, 2 days before the Sportpalast speech. The memo is marked internal/technical and reads, Minister Goebbels has requested the following audio modifications for the February 18th broadcast. 1. Increase reverb on applause by 30% to enhance crowd response. 2. Delay main microphone by 0.3 seconds to allow crowd audio to precede the minister's words, creating impression of interruption by enthusiasm. 3. Compress dynamic range to eliminate silence gaps. The goal, per the minister, make the broadcast sound more enthusiastic than the live event. This is not a rally. This is a recording session, engineered to specifications, designed to manufacture the sonic impression of mass fanaticism for an audience that would experience the event only through radio speakers. The Sportpalast speech, often cited as Joseph Goebbels' rhetorical masterpiece, was not a spontaneous outpouring of Nazi commitment. It was theatrical production down to the reverb settings. The immediate context for the speech was catastrophic. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Over 90,000 German soldiers were captured, the survivors of an army that had numbered nearly 300,000 when the battle began in August 1942. It was the first major, undeniable German defeat, impossible to conceal or reframe as strategic repositioning. Joseph's diary entry from February 3, 1943. The truth is too terrible to report accurately. We must transform defeat into sacrifice, death into martyrdom. I need a stage, and I need an audience that will perform belief. The Sportpalast rally scheduled for February 18th was that stage, and the audience was carefully selected to ensure the performance would succeed. On February 10, 1943, the ministry issued invitations to approximately 47,000 individuals and organizations, selecting 15,000 to attend the rally at the Sportpalast Arena in Berlin. The invitations, preserved in the Bundesarchiv under file NS-18/380, were not random. Recipients included party officials, uniformed military personnel on leave, members of Hitler Youth and League of German Girls, wounded soldiers selected for visibility, and factory workers from Berlin armaments plants who had been identified by their supervisors as politically reliable. Heinrich Glasmeyer's diary, which he kept throughout the war and donated to the Rundfunk Archive in 1968, includes an entry from February 12th. This is not a random crowd. This is casting. The minister wants people who will respond on cue, and the invitations reflect that. No one in that hall will be hearing the speech for the first time. They already know what they're supposed to believe. Joseph rehearsed the speech for 4 hours on February 17th, the day before the event. Glasmeyer's diary describes the process in technical detail. The minister arrived at the Sportpalast at 3 in the afternoon. He practiced specific gestures, vocal crescendos, and pauses. He asked me to play back recordings of his rehearsal so he could hear how he sounded. He adjusted his pacing based on the playback, lengthening certain pauses and increasing volume at specific points. He rehearsed the call and response section. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Do you want total war? 6 times, experimenting with different emphases. This is not improvisation. This is choreography. The speech was scripted not just in text but in performance, every beat timed, every audience reaction anticipated and engineered. The rally began at 5 in the evening on February 18, 1943. The Sportpalast was filled to capacity, 15,000 attendees, and the atmosphere, by all accounts, was electric. But the electricity was not spontaneous. Printed programs distributed before the speech included the text of Joseph's key questions, signaling to the audience when they were expected to respond. The famous call and response, Joseph shouting, "Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?" and the crowd roaring, "Ja!" in response, was scripted into the programs. The crowd knew their lines. Glasmeyer, operating the audio equipment from a booth above the main floor, noted in his diary, "The crowd response was loud, but it was also prompted. The programs told them what to say and when to say it. My job was to make sure the broadcast version sounded even more overwhelming than the live version. He succeeded. The audio engineering amplified the applause, added reverb to make the space sound larger, and used dynamic compression to eliminate the gaps and silences that would reveal hesitation or confusion. The speech itself lasted 90 minutes and covered familiar rhetorical ground: Stalingrad as heroic sacrifice, the Soviet Union as an existential threat, the necessity of total mobilization, the choice between total victory and total annihilation. But the power of the speech lay not in its content, which was largely predictable, but in its form. Joseph built to the climax with 10 questions, each one demanding greater commitment from the audience. "Do you want total war?" was the 8th question, and by the time he asked it, the crowd was primed to respond with maximum intensity. The audio recording, preserved in the Rundfunk archive, captures the crowd's response as a sustained roar lasting nearly 30 seconds. But the unedited version, which also survived, reveals something different: gaps in the roar, moments where sections of the crowd are silent or uncertain before being cued by the responses of those around them. Joseph's genius was editing those gaps out of the broadcast version. He sold Germany an illusion of its own enthusiasm. The speech was broadcast live on all German radio networks and rebroadcast multiple times over the following week. Listeners across Germany and occupied Europe heard the thunderous applause, the echoing chants, the sonic impression of a nation unified in its commitment to total war. But they didn't hear what Glassmeyer heard through his headphones: the artificial amplification, the reverb that made 15,000 sound like 50,000, the pauses that were edited to seem longer and more dramatic. The broadcast was a remix of the live event, optimized for radio, engineered to maximize emotional impact. Joseph understood that the medium shaped the message, and he controlled the medium completely. Joseph's diary entry from February 20th, 1943, 2 days after the speech, is remarkably candid. The Sportpalast speech was a success. The foreign press is calling it a masterpiece of demagoguery, which I take as a compliment. But I must note, the crowd required significant prompting. The fanaticism was not spontaneous. This troubles me. Are we leading the people, or are we dragging them? The line is becoming unclear. Even he knew it was theater, and the knowledge disturbed him because it suggested the regime's control was more fragile than the propaganda implied. If the enthusiasm had to be engineered this precisely, down to the reverb settings in the printed programs, then what did that say about the depth of German commitment to the war? When I listened to the original Sportpalast recording, the unedited version preserved in Soviet archives and not rediscovered until 1991, I hear something that the broadcast version conceals: silence. Not constant roaring, but gaps. Moments where the crowd is quiet, uncertain, before being cued to cheer. Joseph's genius was editing those gaps out, creating an audio document that presented fanaticism as unanimous and inevitable. He sold the performance so effectively that even historians for decades accepted the Sportpalast speech as evidence of genuine Nazi fanaticism in 1943. But the production memos and Glassmeyer's diary tell a different story. The fanaticism was real for some, performed by many, and engineered for all. That's the nature of totalitarian spectacle. It creates the appearance of consensus so convincing that even participants can't always distinguish their own belief from the performance they're contributing to. Chapter 14. The Collapse of the Narrative. In the Bundesarchiv, filed under R-58/179, there is a Sicherheitsdienst Meldung aus dem Reich, report from the Reich, dated November 29, 1943, compiled by SS Sturmbannführer Erich Erlinger, an analyst in the SD's Domestic Surveillance Division. Section 4 of the report, titled Public Reaction to Ministry of Propaganda Announcements, reads, "Increasing segments of the population express skepticism toward official casualty figures and victory claims. Common phrases recorded by informants include, 'They are lying again,' and 'We don't believe the numbers anymore.' Most concerning, This skepticism is now present among party members, not just the politically unreliable. The credibility gap is widening. At the bottom of the page, in red ink, someone, possibly Heinrich Himmler, though the handwriting is not definitively identified, has written, "Send to Minister Goebbels. He needs to see this." There is no evidence Joseph responded to the memo or adjusted his propaganda strategy based on its findings. By late 1943, the infrastructure he had built to control information was still functioning, but the population was no longer listening in the way the system required. The credibility crisis had been building since Stalingrad, but it accelerated through 1943 as military defeats accumulated and the gap between official announcements and observable reality became impossible to ignore. On May 13, 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered to the Allies. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were captured in Tunisia, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad. Joseph's ministry framed the surrender as strategic repositioning to defend Europe's southern flank, language that was technically meaningless but designed to avoid the word defeat. The SD report from May 15, 1943, documents public reaction. The population does not believe the official explanation. Comparisons to Stalingrad are widespread. The phrase Tunisgrad is circulating in Munich and Berlin, suggesting the public understands these are defeats, not repositioning. Morale impact, severe. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, and by September, Italy had signed an armistice and withdrawn from the war. Mussolini was deposed, arrested, and later rescued by German commandos in a propaganda operation that Joseph publicized heavily. But the loss of Italy as an ally was catastrophic for German strategic positioning, and no amount of propaganda could conceal it. Joseph's radio address on September 10, 1943, described Italy's surrender as liberation from Judeo-Bolshevik traitors who infiltrated the Italian government, framing former allies as enemies. The SD report from September 15th. Public reaction is overwhelmingly cynical. Representative comments recorded by informants. First they tell us Italy is our strongest ally. Now they tell us we must defend them from themselves. Which is it? The contradiction is eroding trust in official narratives. The Allied bombing campaign against German cities intensified throughout 1943, and this created a credibility problem that Joseph could not solve through rhetoric. Bombs were observable reality. When Hamburg was firestormed in late July 1943, killing an estimated 40,000 civilians, survivors and refugees spread accounts of the destruction across northern Germany. Joseph's ministry issued directives emphasizing that terror bombing will strengthen German resolve, and that the Luftwaffe is inflicting equivalent damage on British cities. The SD report from August 5, 1943. In bombed cities, citizens openly question why the Luftwaffe cannot defend German airspace. Ministry claims of successful interceptions are contradicted daily by burning neighborhoods. The gap between official claims and lived experience is destroying faith in official information. Erich Erlanger's report from November 18, 1943, is even more explicit. Informants report that the phrase Goebbels' Schnauze, Goebbels' big mouth, is now used colloquially to describe official statements that are immediately recognized as false. The ministry has become synonymous with lying. The most revealing SD reports concern public reaction to casualty announcements. Throughout 1943, the ministry continued to publish sanitized casualty figures that drastically undercounted German losses. The actual casualty data, compiled by the Wehrmacht's Personnel Office and archived in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv under RH-12, shows approximately 1 million German military deaths between January and December 1943. Ministry announcements for the same period suggested total losses of approximately 400,000. The SD report from October 8, 1943. Families receiving death notifications are comparing notes and realizing that official casualty counts do not match the volume of notifications being delivered. The discrepancy is obvious to anyone paying attention. Soldiers on leave describe casualty rates that far exceed official figures. The ministry's numbers are not credible. The June 6, 1944, Allied invasion of Normandy created another credibility crisis that Joseph's propaganda apparatus could not manage. His initial announcement, broadcast on the morning of June 6th, described the landings as an enemy landing attempt in France that is being repulsed with heavy losses. By June 9th, it was clear the Allies had established a secure beachhead and were pushing inland. The SD report from June 12th. The public does not believe we are winning in France. Soldiers on leave describe overwhelming Allied material superiority, numbers of tanks, aircraft, and artillery that exceed anything encountered on the Eastern Front. The ministry's narrative of imminent Allied defeat is not credible. People are waiting for the other shoe to drop. The July 20th, 1944, assassination attempt against Hitler by a group of Wehrmacht officers provided Joseph with an opportunity to stage a propaganda counterattack. He framed the conspirators as traitorous criminals, opposed by loyal Germans, and he orchestrated arrests, show trials, and executions designed to demonstrate regime strength. But the SD reports reveal an unexpected public reaction. Erlinger's report from July 28, 1944. A disturbing percentage of respondents, estimated 15 to 20% in urban areas, express understanding for the conspirators' motives. Some describe the attempt as trying to end the war before Germany is destroyed. This suggests erosion of Führer loyalty itself, not just skepticism toward ministry information. The regime's ideological foundation is cracking. In August 1944, Joseph ordered the SD to stop producing the Meldungen aus dem Reich. The official reason, announced in an internal ministry directive, was that the reports are no longer necessary given the improved morale situation. The actual reason, documented in post-war testimony by SD officers during denazification proceedings, was that Joseph could no longer tolerate reading documentation of his own failure. The surveillance system that had been designed to help him adjust propaganda messaging had instead become a running chronicle of propaganda collapse. Erlinger, in his 1948 denazification hearing, testified, "Minister Goebbels did not want to hear that his messaging was ineffective. The reports showed that people no longer believed official announcements, and rather than adjust the messaging, he shut down the reporting system. It was easier to stop measuring failure than to address it." What strikes me, reading through these SD reports, hundreds of them, compiled weekly between 1940 and 1944, is their clinical tone. Erlinger and his colleagues were not sympathetic to defeatism. They were reporting it the way meteorologists report weather patterns, dispassionately, precisely, with attention to trends and regional variations. They knew the regime was losing the information war, and they documented it with the precision of men filing paperwork on a sinking ship. By late 1944, Joseph was still broadcasting daily, still issuing press directives, still controlling every newspaper and radio station in Germany. The infrastructure was intact. But the audience had stopped listening, and no amount of institutional control could force belief. Propaganda requires voluntary participation, even in a dictatorship, and by 1944, that participation was collapsing under the weight of observable reality. Chapter 15. The Bunker and the Children. In the archive of the Imperial War Museum in London, filed under FO-1019/78, there is a typed Soviet autopsy report dated May 4, 1945, conducted on 6 bodies discovered in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The report lists ages 12, 11, 9, 7, 5, 4. Names: Helga, Hilde, Helmut, Holde, Hedda, Heide. All 6 were found in their bunk beds, dressed in white nightgowns. Cause of death: Vergiftung mit Cyankali, cyanide poisoning. The Soviet medical examiner noted, "The children appear to have been sedated before administration of poison. No signs of struggle. This was methodical." Beside the bodies was a handwritten note from Magda Goebbels, written in fountain pen on Chancellery stationery. "Our children sleep peacefully. They will wake in a better world." This is a murder staged as a bedtime story, and it represents the terminal endpoint of totalitarian ideology. the point where belief requires annihilating reality itself, including children who had no capacity to consent to their own martyrdom. Joseph and Magda Goebbels arrived at the Führer bunker on April 22, 1945, with all 6 children. Berlin was surrounded by Soviet forces. The war was lost. Most government officials and military commanders were attempting to flee the city or negotiate surrender. Joseph, as Gauleiter of Berlin, could have evacuated his family to Bavaria or attempted to reach Allied lines in the west. Instead, he moved them into the bunker, a decision that Rochus Misch, Hitler's SS bodyguard and one of the last surviving witnesses of the bunker's final days, described in his post-war memoir as deliberate. Most staff were trying to escape. Goebbels was moving in, with his wife and all 6 children. He told people, "We will stay with the Führer until the end." It felt rehearsed, like he was performing a script he had written for himself years earlier. The Führer bunker was a 2-level underground structure beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, constructed in 1944 as a command facility and last refuge for Hitler and his inner circle. By late April 1945, it was crowded with approximately 40 people. Hitler, Eva Braun, Joseph and Magda Goebbels and their children, Martin Bormann, several military adjutants, secretaries, and a rotating contingent of guards and support staff. The conditions were claustrophobic: diesel fumes from the ventilation generators, limited food, intermittent electricity, and the constant vibration and dust from Soviet artillery shelling above. Traudl Jung, Hitler's secretary, who survived the war and later published her memoir, described the children's presence as surreal. They played in the bunker corridors, unaware of what was happening. Magda kept them on a strict schedule: meals, lessons, bedtime, as if maintaining routine could protect them from reality. Rochus Misch's account differs slightly from Junge's, and the discrepancy is significant. Misch, in interviews conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, before his death in 2013, described the children as eerily quiet, and noted that Magda was administering sedatives frequently. The children were not playing the way normal children play. They were subdued, compliant, moving slowly. Magda kept them close and gave them medicine. She said it was to help them sleep through the noise of the shelling. But they were sleeping most of the time. I think she was preparing them even if they didn't understand what for. On April 30th, 1945, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in Hitler's private quarters in the bunker. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden and burned with gasoline, a process that Rochus Misch and other witnesses observed. Joseph became, for approximately 30 hours, the Chancellor of a Reich that no longer existed. His first act was drafting a testament, a document that was meant to be discovered by future generations, and that framed his decision to remain in Berlin as the ultimate act of loyalty. The testament, preserved in the Soviet archives and published after the war, reads in part, "I die with the Führer, by choice and conviction. My wife and children join me in this sacrifice. We do not flee. We do not surrender. We remain true to the idea even when the world has rejected it." The language is grandiose, theatrical, and completely dissociated from the reality that he was about to murder 6 children. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, Magda Goebbels administered the poison. The exact sequence of events is reconstructed from testimonies given by bunker survivors, primarily Misch and Helmut Kuntz, an SS dentist who was in the bunker and who testified extensively during Soviet interrogations. Kuntz's testimony, archived in the Russian State Military Archive under Fond 32, states that Magda requested his assistance in sedating the children, but that he refused to participate in killing them. Magda proceeded alone. She gave the children morphine injections. Kuntz later identified the drug based on his medical knowledge and Magda's access to the bunker's medical supplies. And once they were unconscious, she administered crushed cyanide capsules, likely dissolved in liquid and administered orally. The Soviet autopsy findings are consistent with this method. High concentrations of cyanide in stomach contents, combined with morphine in blood samples. Rochus Misch was stationed in the bunker's communication room, approximately 15 meters from the children's sleeping quarters. He heard nothing unusual. No screams, no sounds of struggle. It was silent. Later, around 8 or 9 in the evening, Magda emerged from the room, walked past me in the corridor, and said, "Es ist vollbracht." It is done. Her face was blank. She looked like an actress who had just finished a performance and was still in character. She walked upstairs toward the Chancellery garden without saying anything else. Traudl Jung, who encountered Magda in the corridor shortly after, described her as composed, terrible. She looked at me and said, "The children are sleeping." I knew what she meant, but I couldn't process it. Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up to the Chancellery garden at approximately 8:30 in the evening on May 1, 1945. Accounts of their deaths vary. Some witnesses report they took cyanide, others that they were shot by an SS orderly at their request, but the result was the same. Their bodies were partially burned with gasoline, though the fire was less thorough than the one that consumed Hitler's remains. Soviet forces discovered the corpses on May 2nd and conducted autopsies, confirming identities through dental records. The bodies were buried in unmarked locations, and Stalin ordered the grave sites kept secret to prevent them from becoming neo-Nazi shrines. Joseph's final diary entry, dated May 1, 1945, and discovered with his papers, reads, "We take this step joyfully and with clear conscience. The children do not yet understand, but they will thank us in the next world. We have remained true. That is all that matters. This is not a suicide note. It's a script for mythology, written for an audience he believed would eventually rediscover him and vindicate his choices." When I read Magda's note, "They will wake in a better world," I feel a nausea that transcends historical analysis. This is the final logic of totalitarian propaganda. Reality becomes so unbearable, or ideological commitment becomes so absolute, that death is reframed as salvation. Magda wasn't insane in any clinical sense. She was the ultimate believer, and that's worse. She spent 15 years performing a role, separating private reality from public image, and then, in the end, she collapsed that distinction entirely, killing the children to preserve the mythology. The Goebbels children were the only Nazi leadership children murdered by their own parents. Goering's daughter survived. Himmler's children survived. Speer's children survived. Only Joseph and Magda insisted on this final performance, and it was unique even within the Nazi elite. That tells you something about the depth of their commitment, not to Germany, not to the German people, but to the narrative they had spent their lives constructing. Chapter 16. The Aftermath, Denazification and the Diaries. In the United States National Archives, filed under RG-260, Box 47, there is a denazification questionnaire from Wilfried von Oven, Joseph Goebbels' press adjutant from 1943 to 1945, dated November 1946. The questionnaire is a standardized form used by Allied occupation authorities to assess the level of Nazi involvement and determine appropriate sanctions. Question 12 asks, "Did you believe Minister Goebbels' statements about German victory were truthful?" Von Oven's handwritten answer, "I believed they were necessary. Truth and necessity are not always the same. In wartime, morale is more important than accuracy. This is the logic of the propagandist, unrepentant, and it appears thousands of times across the 12 million denazification questionnaires processed by Allied authorities between 1945 and 1949. The question confronting the occupation forces was not just how to punish Nazi crimes, but how to denazify a population that had been exposed to 12 years of total propaganda. And the answer, as it turned out, was that you couldn't fully. On May 2, 1945, Soviet forces searching the ruins of the Reich Chancellery discovered the partially burned bodies of Joseph and Magda Goebbels in the Chancellery garden. Soviet military intelligence, SMERSH, conducted autopsies and confirmed identities through dental records, which were matched against files seized from the Goebbels family dentist. Stalin ordered the remains kept secret. He feared that the grave sites could become pilgrimage locations for neo-Nazis, and he wanted to deny the Nazi leadership any form of posthumous martyrdom. The bodies were buried in unmarked locations, reportedly moved several times over the following decades. Joseph's propaganda career, which had been built on visibility and media saturation, ended in anonymity, the opposite of everything he had spent his life constructing. The discovery of Joseph's diaries began in July 1945, when Allied forces found glass plate microfilms in a bombed-out bank vault in Potsdam. The microfilms contained typed transcripts of Joseph's diary entries from 1924 to 1941, approximately 17 years of daily or near-daily entries. Robert Kempner, an American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials who later investigated Nazi propaganda networks, wrote in his case notes, "We expected propaganda drafts and strategic memos. Instead, we found a meticulous personal record, self-justification, calculation, occasional doubt, and a running internal monologue of ambition and resentment. The diaries are not confessional. They are Goebbels performing for history, constructing his own mythology, even in private writing." Additional diary fragments were discovered over the following decades: handwritten notebooks in Soviet archives, typewritten pages in a Bavarian forest cache found in 1948. And the complete diaries were not published in full until 1992 through 2005, edited by German historian Elke Fröhlich in a 29-volume critical edition. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, included prosecution of Hans Fritzsche, who had headed Joseph's radio division and had been one of the most prominent voices of Nazi propaganda. Fritzsche was charged as a representative of the propaganda ministry apparatus, given that Joseph himself was dead. Fritzsche's defense was consistent with the answers given by thousands of lower-level ministry employees. He argued that he had only broadcast information provided by superiors and did not create policy. He claimed he was a functionary, not a decision-maker. The tribunal acquitted him, a decision that Robert Kempner found deeply frustrating. Kempner's memo from October 1946. The Fritzsche acquittal demonstrates the fundamental problem with prosecuting propaganda. Everyone in the system claims they were following orders, but the system required millions of individual choices to sustain itself. Goebbels is dead, but his infrastructure survived in its personnel, and we cannot prosecute infrastructure. The denazification process, administered separately in the American, British, French, and Soviet occupation zones, attempted to remove former Nazis from positions of influence and assess individual culpability. By 1949, approximately 12 million Germans had been processed through denazification tribunals or questionnaires. The results were categorized: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated. Of the 12 million processed, approximately 3.6 million were classified as implicated in Nazi activities to some degree, but only 1,667 were prosecuted as major war criminals. The vast majority received fines, temporary job restrictions, or probation. The logistical impossibility of prosecuting millions of people meant that most former Nazis re-entered German society with minimal consequences. Kempner's assessment in 1948, Goebbels' propaganda system implicated so many Germans in media, education, civil service, culture, that removing everyone who collaborated would collapse the state. We are forced to choose between justice and functionality, and we are choosing functionality. The publication of Joseph's diaries became a point of controversy in the late 1940s. Louis Lochner, an American journalist, edited and published a partial English-language edition in 1948 titled The Goebbels Diaries. Critics argued that publication gave Joseph a posthumous platform and risked rehabilitating his image. Kempner defended the decision. "The diaries are evidence. They show how the system worked, the calculations, the cynicism, the techniques. Suppressing them would be another form of propaganda, silence instead of lies. Transparency is the only antidote to what Goebbels built." The debate continues. Is documenting propaganda an act of historical scholarship, or does it risk providing a manual for future propagandists? The residual effects of 12 years of propaganda are documented in surveys conducted in occupied Germany during the late 1940s and early 50s. A 1952 survey conducted by American occupation authorities asked West Germans, "Do you believe the Allied re-education programs accurately portrayed the Nazi regime?" 42% of respondents answered no or partially. This suggests that 7 years after the war, nearly half of Germans remained skeptical of narratives that contradicted their wartime experiences, not because they were committed Nazis, but because Joseph had trained them to distrust all official information. He had poisoned the epistemological ground, teaching Germans to assume that everyone lies, that all narratives are propaganda, that truth is whatever serves power. This mindset doesn't disappear with military defeat. It requires active dismantling, and the Allies, constrained by Cold War priorities and the need to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, did not fully complete that work. When I read the denazification records, the questionnaires, the tribunal transcripts, the employment reviews, I'm struck by the absence of regret. Former propaganda officials don't say they were wrong. They say they were necessary. They frame their work as a professional obligation, divorced from moral consequence. Wilfred von Oven's answer, "Truth and necessity are not always the same," appears in variations across thousands of files. This is the residue of Joseph's epistemology. Truth as utility, information as a tool rather than a representation of reality. This mindset doesn't disappear when the regime collapses. It persists, quietly, in institutional cultures and individual rationalizations, waiting for conditions that might allow it to re-emerge. Joseph died in 1945, but the infrastructure he built, both material and psychological, survived him, and we're still living with its consequences. Chapter 17: Legacy and the Propagandist's Paradox. In the German Propaganda Archive at Calvin University, maintained online since 1998 by Professor Randall Bitwork, there are over 4,000 digitized documents from the Goebbels ministry, speeches, posters, radio transcripts, internal memos, directives. The archive receives over 500,000 visits annually from 170 countries. Professor Bitwork tracks referrer data and visitor patterns, and his findings, published in a 2019 email archived with the collection, are unsettling. Approximately 12% of visitors arrive from URLs associated with political campaign consulting firms. Another 8% come from far-right forums. 6% are from academic media studies programs. The archive was built to educate people about propaganda's dangers, but I cannot control who learns from it, or why. Goebbels is still teaching, and some of his students are taking notes for the wrong reasons. The study of Joseph Goebbels as a propagandist began almost immediately after the war. In the 1950s and 60s, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies conducted analyses of Nazi propaganda techniques for application in Cold War psychological operations. A 1958 CIA memo, declassified in 2001 and now archived at the National Archives in College Park under RG 263, states, "Goebbels' methods for controlling domestic information flow, particularly the integration of radio, press, and film into a unified messaging system, offer applicable lessons for managing public perception in conflict zones. The ideological content is irrelevant. The structural techniques are transferable." The memo is chilling in its clinical detachment. Nazi propaganda is studied as technology, divorced from the moral consequences of its application. The methods are treated as neutral tools that can be repurposed for different ideological goals. By the 1970s and 80s, propaganda studies emerged as an academic discipline in universities across North America and Europe. Joseph became a primary case study in political science and communications courses. Professor Bitwork, who began teaching about Nazi propaganda at Calvin University in 1977, describes the pedagogical dilemma. "We taught Goebbels as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the dangers of media manipulation and the importance of critical thinking. But in teaching how propaganda works, the techniques of repetition, emotional appeal, scapegoating, simplification, We were also creating a checklist. Students learned to identify propaganda, but some also learned to create it. The line between inoculation and instruction is thinner than we'd like to believe. The internet democratized access to Joseph's writings and speeches in ways that would have been impossible before the 1990s. His quotations, some authentic, many apocryphal, began circulating on forums and social media. The most famous misattributed quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." There is no evidence Joseph ever said or wrote this exact sentence, but it's attributed to him thousands of times online, cited in articles and memes, and treated as distilled wisdom about propaganda. The ironic fact that a false quote about lying has been successfully attributed to Joseph Goebbels through repetition is not lost on scholars, but it continues to spread. Meanwhile, authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, Turkey, Hungary, and elsewhere have employed media control strategies that structurally mirror Joseph's ministry: centralized messaging, control of broadcast licenses, harassment of independent journalists, state funding of loyalist media, and the use of propaganda not to convince, but to confuse, flooding the information space with contradictory narratives so that citizens give up on discerning truth. Professor Bitwork's research tracks explicit references to Joseph in contemporary far-right movements. In 2018, a leaked internal memo from a European nationalist political party included a section titled "Lessons from Weimar, Controlling the Narrative," that directly quoted Joseph's 1933 radio speech on the necessity of eliminating Jewish influence from German culture. The memo was not historical analysis, it was operational guidance. We've moved from studying Goebbels as history to watching him be applied in real time. This is what I feared when I started the archive. The methods are being studied not as warnings, but as blueprints. The propagandist's paradox is that documenting propaganda creates an archive that serves dual purposes. It educates those who want to resist manipulation, but it also instructs those who want to replicate it. The rise of digital disinformation between 2010 and 2026 has prompted comparisons to Joseph's techniques. A 2022 study by MIT Media Lab analyzed authoritarian disinformation tactics in 6 countries: Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela, and found structural similarities to Nazi propaganda methodologies documented in the 1930s and 40s. Centralized narrative control, repetition across platforms, use of conspiracy theories to explain contradictions, scapegoating of minority groups, and the tactic of flooding the zone, overwhelming audiences with so much contradictory information that discerning truth becomes exhausting. The study's conclusion? Goebbels did not invent propaganda, but he industrialized it. He created a systematic methodology for controlling information at scale. Modern disinformation is that industrialization scaled by digital technology. The tools have changed. The architecture hasn't. When I hold the engineering schematics for the Volksempfänger, Otto Griesing's original drawings preserved in the Deutsches Museum, I'm reminded that propaganda is infrastructure, not just content. Joseph understood this in the 1930s. He didn't just control what Germans heard. He controlled what they could hear by engineering the receivers themselves. Modern equivalents are subtler, but structurally similar. Algorithmic curation on social media platforms, search engine optimization that prioritizes certain sources, content moderation policies that shape discourse, platform architecture that rewards engagement over accuracy. These are not Goebbelsian in intent. Most are designed to manage scale or maximize profit, but they have Goebbelsian effects. They shape the informational environment in ways that are invisible to most users, creating structural constraints on what information circulates and how it's framed. The question that haunts this entire project is whether historical scholarship on propaganda is inherently risky. By documenting exactly how Joseph manipulated millions, by cataloging the techniques, the production methods, the organizational structures, have historians created a manual for future manipulators? I don't have a definitive answer, but I lean toward transparency. Suppression creates mystique and allows techniques to be rediscovered independently. Open documentation with critical context at least allows for informed resistance. But the risk remains. For every person who studies Joseph to understand how to resist propaganda, there may be another who studies him to understand how to replicate it. In 2014, the German government debated banning publication of Mein Kampf after its copyright expired. The ban was ultimately rejected, and an extensively annotated critical edition was published instead. The logic? Suppression creates forbidden fruit. Open access with scholarly annotation is safer because it contextualizes and critiques rather than mythologizes. The same principle applies to Joseph's writings and speeches. But there's a troubling data point. In a 2021 survey of German high school students, 68% could identify Joseph Goebbels by name and role, but only 31% could explain why his propaganda was effective or how to recognize similar techniques in contemporary media. We remember the name, we've forgotten the lesson. Joseph Goebbels died on May 1, 1945, in a bunker in Berlin, his regime collapsing around him, his 6 children murdered by their mother's hand to preserve ideological purity. But his methods did not die with him. They were archived, studied, adapted, and in some cases explicitly revived. His ultimate legacy is not the Third Reich, which lasted 12 years and collapsed in fire. His legacy is the methodological template he created, a toolkit for controlling information at scale, for engineering consensus, for making propaganda infrastructural rather than incidental. That toolkit has been dissected by intelligence agencies, taught in universities, replicated by authoritarian regimes, and deployed in digital spaces where the scale and speed exceed anything Joseph could have imagined. The propagandist's paradox is this: we cannot understand the history of the 20th century without studying Joseph Goebbels, but studying him means preserving and circulating the very techniques that made him so dangerous. There is no resolution to this paradox, only vigilance. Every generation must relearn that propaganda works not because audiences are stupid, but because human beings are social animals who crave coherent narratives, who trust familiar sources, who can be overwhelmed by contradictory information, and who sometimes choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. Joseph understood these vulnerabilities and exploited them with clinical precision. His ghost isn't haunting us. We're actively summoning him every time we deploy his playbook, whether in political campaigns, marketing strategies, or information warfare. The only question is whether we'll recognize what we're doing in time to stop.